Noah Falstein, welcome back to Tech Talk with Daniel Albu.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you were on Tech Talk back in early 2023 when we talked about your entire career. Then in 2024, we did 3 live streams where we played the Wits Path of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. And that was your first time experiencing that path. And now we meet again, just in time for the 30th anniversary of the dig. Talk about your version of the game, which was the very first version of the game, unlike the 4th version, which is the final one. But before we jump into that cancelled project, I'd love to talk about a few of your other cancelled projects.
My pleasure.
Take a look at this.
Oh my, yes. These must be from Eric's collection.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of design documents over here, and a few of them have your name written as the project lead.
It's, Eric has published a lot of this stuff. I have a similarly large group. We've compared notes, and we've got probably about 50% overlap, and then 50% different. So I've seen quite a few of these. Oh, that one is a surprise to me. There's David Fox is actually out in Germany right now at Gamescom, and this is also would it be the 30th anniversary of the Amiga launch, something like that. And there's a lot of celebration going on around the world. And Germany was actually one of the biggest hotbeds for Amiga as well as for LucasArts stuff. So,
yeah, I know. He contacted me earlier today because he needed a video I used in my conversation with Annie Fox, because she has talks over there, and he has also. Right. They both have talks in that conference. So yeah, but over here it says David Foz, not David Fox.
Well, actually, he's a little known member of the team that David Foz.
Money laundering employee.
Yes,
faux employee.
Of all of the unfinished LucasArts projects that I was involved with, my favorite was one that was primarily around Gilbert creation called I Was a Teenage Lobot. Mm-hmm. And a brilliant concept that was perfectly set up to make use of what the Commodore 64 could and couldn't do, and sort of the state of the art and parser-based games and all of that. And a very, very funny situation. I just remember the brainstorming sessions. We just kept laughing at the comedy we were putting into it. So I don't know if that's one of the ones you've got in this list, but
no, I don't have it over here. I want let's see if you remember any of these games. What is the Adventures in the Party Zone about?
Well, let's see. I think that was one of several games that we were looking at to do multiplayer community games, as we Chip had done Habitat at that point, and it was still kind of struggling to find a financial footing, and actually never really did in those incarnations. But we kept looking for ways to expand the range of what could be done. I mean, it's one of the things I tell developers, new developers now, and this day and age, that one of the great things about the 80s is that we were constantly discovering new genres. Even by the late 80s, there were some groundbreaking games that were just coming out that were radically different than anyone had seen before. And this is right around the time that Wolfenstein and Doom were in development. And with Habitat, we had our very first graphic, massively multiplayer game. And we did a few things at LucasArts that were what today would be called casual games or party games. And I don't remember the details of this one. I think I do have a copy of this this document myself. Hold on a moment. Let me manipulate these things. The version I have is slightly different, and it it looks the same here. Concept document 101089. But for whatever reason, mine also says Noah Falstein based on discussions with Orson Scott Card. And, there are quite a few games now out there that are meant for people to play at parties, and, some really clever ones out there. But it was a way of using it might have been Scott Card's idea now that I think about it, because he was working with us on a bunch of projects then, including The Dig a little bit later, not my version of it. And he had a lot of ideas to contribute, mostly story-based, but in this case, it was a whole game genre of trying to make a computer game that was meant to be played out by a bunch of people who were together for a party.
And the interesting thing about this design document is that it's dated 10/10/89, which is exactly 1 week before the San Francisco earthquake.
Yep. Yeah, well, that time, I'm sure we'll get into this in a little more depth, but that particular period, there was a lot of back and forth. Oh yeah, that was another one I really enjoyed. We were throwing the whole group of project leaders was, actually, not surprisingly, because in just a month or two before that, the Last Crusade game had been finalized, and Ron, David, and I were suddenly free from having to work on that, and everybody was scrambling to come up with new ideas or to, get on projects that we knew were likely to happen, and all sorts of stuff was floating around. I think there were several in my list of the documents I saved. I noticed there were quite a few in that area. Eric Wilmunder, I remember, was also contributing some, and Gary Winnick, and everybody was busy sort of trying to come up with the next great new idea. Agent of the Empire was much more hardcore science fiction, which was my main interest. And that one was kind of inspired by some of the science fiction I grew up as a kid, where there were one or two people that kind of went up against really big odds. Not surprisingly, very similar to kind of the Star Wars mentality, but we're trying to come up with something fresh.
That was dated 1985. What else do we have here? We have alternate realities.
See, that was what Chip and I were working on together before he turned a lot of those ideas into Habitat and broke it up. We had a lot of ideas. Chip was the main guy behind a lot of our technology. He came on board immediately after I did in '84, and was our tools guy, and was coming up with. He helped Ron create the SCUM system, and he just did a lot of groundbreaking work for us, and on almost all of the software tools that we had. But that idea was, again, to explore networked games, which at that point meant networks like Genie or, what was it? I guess it was before America Online. It was Quantum Link. That's what he did Habitat on. And the Star Cage, that was a favorite of mine. That turned out to be a very similar concept to the one that Hal Barwood had. It was one of the ways we bonded, is that he had actually made an Apple II game, and I had proposed a sort of similar story of people being stolen by aliens and put into a kind of a traveling zoo or a collection that the aliens were making of other alien life forms. And the humans on board the ship that has collected them break free and unite with the other alien races to overthrow the guys that have kidnapped you.
So you published this a month after that initial big meeting. Did any of the elements that were discussed in that meeting merge themselves into this project, or?
Well, I have to say,
completely original?
With all of these, as you've no doubt seen, and I've been interested in watching your interviews, our memories fade or get a little bit blurry, and you get different stories from different people. Everybody has a tendency to think that something was their idea when there were other people involved, or whatever. It can be pretty humbling, actually, when you kind of see the details and realize that, oh, I guess I didn't do what I thought I did. I just remember it that way. So all of my memories about that time are a little fuzzy, I should say. And there was a lot going on as well. That I had just gotten married the year before, and as far as my wife and I can figure, within a few days of the earthquake was when she conceived our daughter. So at that point, I didn't know it, but not long after that, I found that she was pregnant with our only child. So there's a lot going on in my life, as well as the work side of things.
And you still had time to release design documents for new games.
Well, I mean, that was after Last Crusade went out. There was, it was a really hard push to get it out into the stores while the movie was still in the theaters, and we did, even largely due to the fact that movie ran the entire summer of 1989. It just stayed popular for months at that point, and everybody was pretty much exhausted. And I think. Again, I'm not sure about this, but I think I probably collaborated on more design documents than anyone else, with the possible exception of Ron. He and I collaborated on many things ourselves, but also would jump in when other people were doing brainstorming sessions and try and help them come up with more fully fleshed out ideas.
Awesome. Now, I recently released my conversation with Sierra Online animator Ali Fragio, where we talked about a Leisure Suit Larry platformer that ended up getting canceled. But I understand you also worked on a Leisure Suit Larry game that got canceled. What can you share about that one?
Dave Grossman and I worked on that together. I brought in Dave on that because I was approached by High Voltage Software that had bought the rights and had done one Leisure Suit Larry game on their own, and were working on a sequel. The complaints they had from the first game, they'd gone away from a lot of what the original Leisure Suit Larry did, and a lot of their players, it did reasonably well, so they wanted to do another Leisure Suit Larry game, but they realized it needed more of the old adventure game comedy kind of thinking. And I think they actually approached Al Lowe, but he just wasn't interested. I'm not sure about the details there. But then they came to me, and I said, well, I can do that. But I knew that Dave was also freelancing, and he was much more experienced in comedy games. And we had done some collaboration, including The Dig, of course, together. And I was looking forward to that. That they had a pretty advanced Leisure Suit Larry game that was very linear, and we came in and introduced the whole idea of the design documents that Ron had come up with. His what do we call those? Oh gosh, I've forgotten. We all had different names for exactly what they were, but it was it looked like a flow chart, but it was really a puzzle dependency diagram or chart, or depending on who you were talking to. And the producer of that game, that High Voltage game, just loved that idea. And we reworked a lot of the game he did and made it more bushy, is the way we put it, where instead of a single path through, you had multiple things you could do. So if you got stuck on one puzzle, there was a parallel one you could work on, and the solution to one puzzle helped you solve another one that you might not have solved yet. And a lot of little tricks we learned how to do that the High Voltage people just weren't familiar with, since they hadn't done adventure games before. And there's a lot of, I have to say, I'm not really a fan of the sort of raunchiness of the Leisure Suit Larry games, but we tried to bring some of our LucasArts sensibilities. And I'll just say, just because I never miss an opportunity to pass this on, since it's never going to see the light of day, but one of the puzzles that we designed, that Dave and I did with their group, involved, there's a guy, one of the characters in the game is depressed and wants to throw a party, and gets, sends away for some tanks of helium to make party balloons. But when it arrives, the balloons just sink. It's not helium. And you can't figure out when it went on at first. And then you realize that it's nitrous oxide, otherwise known as laughing gas. And it's like, well, that's really weird. How we need to find the helium. It's very clear. He says, I'll still be depressed until my balloons float. And you go out into the town that you're in. And as you're wandering around the town, you hear high-pitched screaming. And it's like it's disturbing sound. And there's a dentist's office. And from the windows, you're hearing people screaming in pain, but in sounding like this. And it turned out, of course, that the nitrous oxide and the helium tanks got switched. But it was very much in the vein of Leisure Suit Larry. But I always was looking forward to shipping that and having people have that flash of insight of, what does this screaming mean? Why are they talking? And suddenly realizing, putting it all together and tracking down the missing helium tanks. And I think there was another puzzle you needed to do to swap them back out again. But it was that kind of thing, and there were a lot of sex jokes and a lot of jokes involving getting drunk, which I have to say we certainly did a lot of that in our LucasArts days. Virtually every game had getting some character drunk in order to get past them as a guard or convince them to give you some information.
Right. So was this a LucasArts style adventure game with Sierra humor? Was it a Sierra-like game in a LucasArts spirit? How would you describe it?
Even more complex. I would say it was a Sierra humor game as done by a third party that had never done adventure games, that grafted on some redesign, and it never came out. It actually got quite far along, but the producer who was putting it all together ended up, I think, getting a job offer he couldn't refuse, and he left the company. And without him at the helm, they just realized they didn't have anybody who could finish it. And perhaps, I don't know, it often happens that companies realize that their initial projections for how profitable something was going to be might have been too optimistic. I don't really know the details because I was just a consultant there. But yeah, it never got finished. Somewhere, I'm sure, usually people keep their copies of the design docs, and that one was very complete. I do have some of the puzzle dependency diagrams that Dave and I worked out for that game.
Wow.
So
I'd love to see that.
Well, maybe it's a future show. Get Dave and I on together to talk about that.
Dave never talked about that game. You were the one who introduced me to the concept of a LucasArts employee working on a Sierra game.
Well, we flew out to Chicago and did an intensive, I think it was about a week-long session with them, and then went back and did a lot of stuff remotely. But all in all, I look back at the stuff that I've done, and I have worked on hundreds of games that have never been published. Sometimes as little bit as contributing to a design document, sometimes actually getting one almost finished, or even in at least one or two cases completely finished, and then it just never got released. So okay. It's very easy for Dave to have forgotten, or just not think about that particular one.
Now, I came across this old 1985 Lucasfilm Games yearbook where it mentions your family was large, but abbreviated for the yearbook. And it lists your school as Hampshire College and Amherst and Massachusetts, right?
Well,
these are the abbreviations.
The deal was that they, the people who put the yearbook together, emphasized keep it really brief. People are writing too long, so abbreviate everything that you can. And a lot of us were joking about that, and it was kind of an in-joke, not particularly funny, but that's why. My family was not particularly large, but that was the point. Saying that it was abbreviated for the yearbook was kind of digging the people who ran the yearbook, to say, just give us a little more room. So whenever I could, I stuck stuff into initials and abbreviations. Williams Electronics in Illinois, that sort of thing.
So what I wanted to ask is what were SF and G plus S and some unabbreviatable?
Well, SF is science fiction, which gets confusing when you're living near San Francisco because
Exactly.
the way it's used. GNS is Gilbert and Sullivan, which is my very outdated musical interest. It was already ancient, when I got into it. Just my brother introduced me to it all, and it's always been a series of basically early musicals that I've always enjoyed.
Okay, now moving on to the dig, the Noah Falstein version. You found out you'd be leading the dig during a project leader meeting at Skywalker Ranch, right when the 1989 San Francisco quake hit. On the same day, was it mid conversation?
It was in the middle of the meeting. Yep. Yeah, I think the quake was around 5:04 p.m., something like that, and our meeting, I think, had run from like 4:30 and was due to end at 6 o'clock or so. And we did finish the meeting actually after things calmed down, but it was nobody really knew what the damage from the earthquake had been, and the initial news was just starting to come in, so we were a little distracted.
So you guys dove under the table and then just came out and continued the meeting as if.
I'm sure we didn't. Everybody was concerned, and we all had. Most of us had family members. There were other places when it was pre-cell phones, so there were a lot of calls that went out. And as I recall, the phone system held up, but we were able to ascertain that people we knew were okay. And there were quite a few people. I think almost 50 people who died in that. The majority of them in a freeway collapse in the East Bay, and I think it was Mark Ferrari, one of our artists, was on the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge when the quake hit. And he at first thought that there was something wrong with his car because he just felt that he was sliding back and forth on the bridge. And then he realized all the cars were sliding back and forth because the bridge itself was moving. And I just, much more terrifying than being in the main house at Skywalker Ranch. But the sequence that got burned into my brain, and I think this is pretty accurate because we retold it over and over again right from that day, is that the quake started fairly mild, and we had all experienced earthquakes. It's interesting. There haven't been that many recently, which is a little ominous, but for a while in that period, you would always have smaller earthquakes, and you got over it pretty quickly. And Brian Moriarty was a bit phobic about earthquakes, and to compensate had started studying them and had a big map on the wall in his office of push pins where there had been earthquakes. And so when it started to shake, a bunch of us turned to Brian, and I think somebody said, "Hey, here's another one for your wall." And then it went from this sort of mild shaking to suddenly really violent shaking. And we all looked at each other in kind of immediate terror. And Brian said, "Get under the table." And my memory of it was almost like a cartoon where you could sort of see people looking at each other. And he says, "Get under the table." And we look at this table, which was this huge mahogany table. I think it could seat about 20 people, a very long sort of boardroom table. All the stuff in the main house was all very new at that point and only been around for a few years and beautifully built, and looked at this really sturdy table. And then it felt like almost a cut. We were all under the table, except for 2 or 3 people who decided to run out of the room and out of the front door and get out of the building. And there are multiple ways of thinking about how to survive earthquakes, and most of them involve sheltering in place. So I think Brian was right about that. And I remember being under the table looking into across the hall into the next room, and there were chandeliers in that room. And I saw it swinging so far back and forth that it was almost hitting the ceiling in its swinging. And there was something fell over and crashed upstairs, and we heard somebody scream. Turned out later to be James to be George Lucas's assistant, and nobody was injured, or at least not seriously that I knew of, but a lot of people were very frightened by it. So it was quite dramatic. It was, by far the strongest earthquake I've ever experienced firsthand. And it just, on top of the very momentous news of being greenlit to work on the Spielberg project, it was very disconcerting. Anyway, long story long. I don't recall. My sense is that we continued to talk about a few issues, but it just in a distracted way, and then ended up going home for the day.
And was Spielberg in that meeting?
Oh, no. Although we did have meetings with him in that room later on. It was, the sort of a typical place that when you had particularly famous people like that, it was the one of the coolest places on the ranch to do it.
Now, Spielberg originally pitched the dig as a mix between the Treasure of Sierra Madre and Forbidden Planet. When you first heard that idea, what was your creative vision for it? First of all, did you actually see those movies before he pitched this idea?
I had been a huge fan of Forbidden Planet and had seen it several times. I mean, I haven't watched it in some years, but it aged much better than a lot of other 1950s science fiction movies. And it's amusing to see it and realize how much of it Gene Roddenberry lifted for the original Star Trek. It's almost identical in many respects, down to the sort of three main characters and a captain who's always interested in seducing the beautiful young women he meets along the way. Anyway, I was very familiar with that. I had not seen Treasure of the Sierra Madre, or if I had, it had been, on some rerun and on television, and I just didn't pay much attention. So I immediately went out and got, I guess it was a videotape at that point, and rewatched it. And after I saw the movie, Steven's pitch became really crystal clear. I mean, it's one of those things where it's a cliche of this movie is A meets B, and there you throw two other movies, usually popular movies that don't seem to fit together, and it's like, wow, I've came up with a new idea. In this case, he had a really interesting twist. And well, let me go back a little further, because I think that your viewers will enjoy that. Originally, all of this happened because earlier that summer, when The Last Crusade game was, I think, not even yet released, but in final beta testing, we had given Spielberg a copy. And although there was a phone number to call in for Hintline and stuff, in his case, partly because we started it before it went live with that final game, but also because it was Steven Spielberg, we gave him our direct phone lines, and the three project leaders, fielded the questions. Although I always had assumed that the three of us did it equally, and I find that David Fox got a little shortchanged, and he's, still a little miffed about that. But it was, I think, just whoever happened to be available when, oh, it's Steven Spielberg, it's another call for you, Noah. And at first it was like, oh my God, but he literally, I don't think he ever played the game on his own. He would set it up and call one of us to have us walk, basically be like a walkthrough guide. And so it was really fun at first, but by the time we got through most of the game, it was like, oh, Ron, can't you take him this time? So no, I'm really busy. All right, fine, I'll do it. But Ron was on with him when Stephen was going through the Castle Grunwald, and Max Spielberg, Stephen's son, who is now a game developer, was sitting on Stephen's lap, apparently. I mean, we didn't have video at that point, but that's what Stephen said, and we heard him in the background with his child's voice. And at a lull in that process, Ron said, Stephen said, hey, I had this idea that my friend Brian De Palma and I had come up with, and we thought it might make a good video game. And would you guys be interested in that? And so, Ron said, sure, realizing we'd absolutely love to have that. The idea he had with Brian De Palma, it was for a movie that I won't go into now. He gave us the plot for it. He actually changed his mind in between asking Ron to do that and saying, oh, I've got a better idea now, because Amazing Stories, his TV show, had been going on for a while. And he had a script or a concept for a script for that story that he realized it was too big and too expensive to make into a TV series episode. But that was the Treasure of Sierra Madre meets Forbidden Planet concept. And so, once he explained it to us, I could immediately see how it had the elements from each of the two. It was actually almost a perfect blend of, in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, you get a group of people who are going out prospecting in the Mexican hills. And at first they're all strangers, but they're getting along fine. And then they start to find gold, and they start finding lots of gold. And suddenly they're realizing, wow, we're up here in the hills and we need to take all this gold back into town. And do I trust these guys? And I think he's trying to figure out how to, knock me on the head or make a deal with someone else. And seems totally unrelated to Forbidden Planet, which, basically was people on a planet finding old technology from an ancient race that, caused all sorts of problems, without getting into it. But Stephen's idea was that instead of digging up gold, you're being an archaeologist on an alien planet. And similarly to Treasure of Sierra Madre, the team that's doing it gradually starts getting influenced by what they find. Instead of the gold corrupting them, it's something about the aliens corrupting them, getting inside their heads, as they do in Forbidden Planet. And the team starts mistrusting each other and gets into fighting with each other. And they have to figure out how to escape this planet and deal with what they found out, the secrets of these ancient aliens. And when he put it together that way, it's like, wow, it's a really good twist. Unless you told us that it was those two together, I doubt anyone would think of that. Maybe they'd get us some of the flavor of Forbidden Planet, but anyway, it was a really brilliant mix of ideas, and I, as well as I think the rest of the team, thought it was a great initial concept, although quite ambitious for our technology at the time.
Wait, so what was Brian De Palma's idea exactly?
Okay, well, I figure if this screenplay hasn't been written yet, it's not going to happen. Story about four guys who, and it's funny, Stephen pitched this to us, and I just heard it once, but it played out in my mind like a movie. He's very good at describing these sorts of things. You get a group of these four guys that are all working at the same place, and they all carpool in together. And one of them, they have this routine they go through every day where somebody has the car and he picks up the second guy and the third guy and the fourth guy. And they always see things happening, like there's a homeless guy on the road in one place, and there's a shopkeeper who's always, yelling at his dog or something. And, they all joke about it, and you sort of get that established at the beginning. And then in that town, there's a series of murders that start happening. And the murders are all the disconnected people that they see on their drive in. And gradually, the four people in the car start to think, could one of my coworkers be the killer? Because the only thing connecting them is our ride in, and there's no other reason that we can imagine or that the police can imagine. And so elements, in fact, of Sierra Madre and the dig, in that sense. But that was, and it sounds much more like a Brian De Palma Spielberg thing, with a slightly comedic but very ominous murder mystery kind of edge to it all.
Wow, sounds like an awesome premise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Spielberg, turns out he's a pretty good screenwriter. So what do you know?
Who knew? Now, during the production of the dig, you met with Steven 4 times, twice at Skywalker Ranch, and then twice in LA at Steven's office.
I think it was once in his office. He had a home. Well, gosh, where was the? No, it was a little more complicated than that, because there was a conversation at his home on Long Island as well. But I think it was one of those 4, not a 5th one.
So twice at Skywalker Ranch and once in his Emblem office and once at his home office.
That's correct. And then, as I'm saying, we definitely met with him on Long Island. I just have some very vivid memories of the guest house there, but it might have been incidentally and not so much specifically about the dig, because I remember that my boss was having a private conversation with him. I think that's what it was. It was a dig meeting, but it was more about the business details and not about the story and creativity aspects of it.
What do you mean the business details? Like, the way the...
Well, for example, one of the things that Stephen insisted on was that the name of the co-designer, project leader, be given equal prominence to his name. He didn't want it to be a Steven Spielberg game with some fine print mentioning, Noah Falstein, or as it happened, Sean Clark not getting credited. And that was very generous of him, and because obviously his name was the big draw. But there were also questions of royalties and rights and all that sort of stuff that they needed to work out.
So the first design document was published on December 6th, 1990. So these 4 meetings were before that initial document was published, or some before, some after?
The process of all of my work in that first version took place over several months. The one you're talking about is the one that's surviving, but I'm pretty sure it was an evolution of earlier documents that we just didn't hold on to the copies of all of those. And certainly a lot of ideas that got thrown around and thrown out, and even the ideas that are in the most recent document were already being gone. I designed that logo with I was very proud of that one, because I'm not an artist or logo designer, but I wanted something that looked a little archaeological, but also had a sense of puzzles and everything. And it just felt, normally, as you've seen in these other documents, they're just different fonts, but that's about as fancy as we got.
For the record, it looks awesome. I really like it.
Thank you.
It would have been great to see them walking around these rooms, and then the camera zooms out, and then you see the dig.
Yes.
So, are these your notes over here?
No, that's not my handwriting. Can this be used? Cells can be used twice by others. Puzzle. Yeah, boy, it's hard to even read this, but it's actually as difficult to read as my handwriting, but it's definitely not mine. So this must have been, I wonder if it was Eric Wilmunder's copy, because he had so many of the ones that got distributed. But
you both could have been doctors with this handwriting.
Yes, indeed. But no, I'm just, because there's something about cells can be used twice, that sounds like it was one of our tech people. And of course, Eric was working with Ron on the SCUM system, and that's not Ron's handwriting. I definitely would recognize that. But no, that was clearly, it's interesting, as I've got the same copy. Maybe I got this from Eric, but I don't recall who wrote that stuff.
So the second document is the one that's dated January 4th, 1991, which is about a month later, exactly a month later.
Yep.
And we're going to go over all of the differences, but this is the document. Okay. And there's another one from January 30th, 1991. which is this one. Now, this one only centers around the story without any of the other elements. So I wonder if it's an official document or if it was an appendix to the original document.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. 11/12/05.
No, this one's 11/12/05 because that's the date you donated it to the Dig Museum.
No, I don't think so. I think the way that our documents worked is that that's probably the date it was printed. So yeah, the last update is correct, but that date at the top must have been somebody printed it out, and that was long after I had left. I don't recall the full sequence of it. It was a complex and troubled production, not just for me, but for all four of the project leaders. And so there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of ideas that were put out and circulated, and in some cases partially implemented and discarded. And in other cases, they were all part of, for my version, the majority of it was just design documents, although we did have, as you've seen, the stuff I sent to you just yesterday, there was quite a bit of artwork that was done for it. And as happened with our other games, the artists would work based on our descriptions, and the art they produced would give us other ideas for puzzles or places to do things. And there was quite a bit of that back and forth going on there. And we did have a few of the rooms that were just starting to be put into SCUM format with animations you could do of doors opening and closing. And one fairly elaborate puzzle that I was quite proud of that involved, we can get into the details when you're ready to do that, but it involved freezing and melting water.
I have a question about that one.
Okay, I figured you would.
Now, if we compare the documents, given the fact that there's just a month between them, it's interesting that there are major differences in the story, in the gameplay. So, for example, in the December 1990 design document, the Dig had really clear external conflict. You wake up, there are hostile aliens, and suddenly you're running for your life. But, just a month later, the focus shifted to something much more personal, where the real conflict can come from how your characters treat each other. And so it seems like the first draft was more like Forbidden Planet, and the second draft was more like Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Well, what I remember is not even the first draft, but the first ideas I was proposing were very big concepts that I wanted to add role-playing elements to the game. It was something that, intriguingly, with the Quest for Glory series, Sierra was doing some similar stuff of saying, all right, let's make a graphic adventure, but have inventory. Well, we all had inventories, but have different qualities, different members of a group, almost like a role-playing game that you could use. And that seemed good because originally, of course, Stephen gave us this concept of a team of people that fight among each other. And the very earliest concepts had like 6 or 8 characters. I think that's in some of these documents. And then we started realizing there's just no way we can do all the animation for 8 characters and the complexity of having different roles for each of them. And so I ended up boiling it down. I took the different characters with their different characteristics and kind of boiled them down into 2 people who were naturally opposing each other. And basically at the same time, this is when Hal and I were working on Fate of Atlantis. And so there were elements of the paths, the multiple path thing in what I was doing here, where you have to pick early on one of the 2 characters, and it's the other one who you think is trying to deceive you. And I thought, well, this is a nice, simple, inexpensive way to get that sense of a group of people not trusting each other. you're only a single player, and we then don't have to control multiple characters at once. But whichever character you pick, you're suspicious of the other one, and you'd have reason to want to play it through again from the other character's point of view. And it would be intriguing that in each case you think it's the other guy who's the one who's deceiving or menacing you.
And it's interesting because the replayability in the original design document revolved around the fact that you can, choose different characters, while the replayability in the second one, a month later, revolved around the puzzles themselves. Like each character has their own skills, and so you can solve this puzzle from a more technical point of view, or you can learn how to do it or have a different solution for that puzzle.
Well, I've always been big on multiple pathways, multiple solutions, and with both Last Crusade and more so in Fate of Atlantis, I got a chance to do that. And this was another version where that was a strong element that I remember consciously wanting to bring to it all. But the scope issues kept being a problem that, because it was Spielberg's involvement, I was thinking really big. And to be fair, actually, we always tended to overreach a bit in our early designs and then realize, okay, we need to cut back. And we'd found it was a pretty good method because you end up thinking big and doing something really ambitious and, throwing away all the boring stuff and hopefully ending up with the best parts. And that was the kind of process that was underway here, but we never really got to the later stages of being able to implement big chunks of it and see what was working and what wasn't. And, the kinds of things that you've been finding of entire rooms or sequences that were cut out but remain in the source code, that sort of thing. That process happened quite a bit with our games.
You guys did a great job on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade because you had a movie or the structure of a movie, and then you created the gameplay of the adventure game. Not the action game is a different game altogether, but the point-and-click adventure game revolved around that script. So that gave you a sense of how to create a movie script in the game format. So why did you work the same way on this game? Like have a movie script and then create gameplay around it instead of starting from the gameplay and then creating the movie around it.
It's a good point. I think it's because we were game players and game designers. And the story that's in those documents, I cringe when I reread it. I just see so many things about it that, I remember the excitement of writing it and thinking it was really great. And in retrospect now, I can just see all the mistakes I made or the ideas I stole from other, science fiction books or movies that I enjoyed and kind of mashed them together. And this was also somewhat in parallel, but mostly before I ended up working with Hal on the Fate of Atlantis stuff. And I learned more from Hal about screenwriting and structuring stories, than any other single person I've ever worked with. So, I feel a little bit better about the story quality and, or lack thereof in these documents because I just, I was still in the first 10 years of my career at that point, and I just hadn't had much experience in the writing side. It had almost all been very simple games where there really wasn't much story involved. So I kind of went overboard with a very complex story and very complex gameplay on top of that. And Dave Grossman and I worked together, and the story you read in there has a lot of his elements in there as well, particularly the wry humor elements. And there's some stuff about a badger philosophy that was an idea that these aliens had about peace. And that odd name Badger is just because that was a nickname that Dave had. And when we were trying to come up with a placeholder name for it, he said, "How about Badger?" And all right, sounds good. So there was quite a bit that he contributed to it. But
don't put yourself down. I think the script is amazing. both of them.
Thank you.
That's why I still want to see this game come to life at one point or another.
Well, I have thought subsequently that the main idea that Stephen had of a team of people that are working together at first but gradually mistrust each other, these days, of course, you do that as a multiplayer game. And it would be perfect if they're all, players and not made up characters. They would take the roles of different characters, obviously. But I've thought there are some ways with, modern technology, even, 15, 20 years ago, I was starting to go through my mind that maybe it'd be time to see whether, there was a chance to redo this. That was before Lucasfilm got sold to Disney. And, subsequent to that, I just, gave up on any thought of that. But yeah, I think, Stephen's original concept was very simple and very compelling. And I think it could be done well. Were I to do this over again, I would. There are elements that I am still very impressed by. The alien design that we ended up with, I thought was really interesting, and some of the story elements I think could have worked really well. But in general, there's too much explaining to do, I think, to kind of get through the story that I had come up with. It might have worked as a novel. I don't think it really would have worked as a game. But, other people had the same misgivings, I'm afraid.
It's interesting because games nowadays are either too short or too long. You either have like 2 hours of gameplay, a Telltale adventure game where you have timed events and you make several choices and that's it. You watch a few cutscenes, game over after 2-3 hours. And you have the other side of the spectrum, which is like, 150 hours of gameplay, 200 hours of gameplay. So I think that the problem with this game, with this project at the time, was that you guys were shooting for 40 hours of gameplay. And maybe with 40 hours of gameplay, you don't have a lot of time for all this exposition because you actually have to have the gameplay itself. But maybe today, with more on the 150-hour side, give them like 60 hours of exposition.
Well, one of the things that compelled me about both stories of the movies that Stephen brought up were that there's quite a bit revealed as you go along, and twists and turns. With Sierra Madre, just it was much simpler. It was just the idea of greed causing people to mistrust each other. But with Forbidden Planet, there's a real mystery of, there was a whole set of human colonists, and there's only one survivor and his daughter, who I think was born on the planet, if I remember correctly, and a really cool robot and a bunch of other amazing technology. But he's very cagey about what put him there, and that was in fact in turn based on Shakespeare's The Tempest as the template for Forbidden Planet. So everybody always borrows from what's gone before or that happened. I'm sure Shakespeare had it was cribbing from some ancient Greek stuff with that. But it's the more that I've done this sort of work, and also the more I've worked with really good writers who are much better at it than I am, the more I realize that revealing these sorts of things, it's often a lot of what keeps us interested in games that are lasting for, tens, if not hundreds of hours. You want to have some twists and turns, but ideally you always want a twist or a turn that is both surprising, and then once you hear what it is, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. One of my absolute favorite examples of that was The Sixth Sense, where the first time I watched that, all through the movie, I was actually, I think, mumbling to my wife about, that doesn't make any sense, or, why are they taking the bus? That's crazy. Why would he do that? And then the very end of the movie, M. Night Shyamalan goes and, basically makes fun of you for having missed the 50 clues that he dropped. In some cases, watching that movie over and over again, you start to see huge amounts of foreshadowing or even just explaining what is going to happen later in the movie, but you don't realize it at the time. And then suddenly it all makes sense. And you get the montage scene where all those different things that were weird and didn't quite feel right, suddenly, of course, they don't feel right because of the final reveal. I'm being careful here, but anybody who hasn't seen The Sixth Sense by now probably has heard the big reveal there.
Spoilers ahead for The Sixth Sense, if anyone hasn't watched it yet. It's easier for us to grasp that a married couple is not talking to each other instead of thinking, hey, he might be dead all along.
Well, my favorite thing on rewatching was that his wife is working in a jewelry store, and there's a young Indian couple, and she's selling them a wedding ring, and she's talking about how the wedding ring is such a symbol of your marriage. And there's some line in it about it sort of lasting after death, or I'm probably mixing it up now with something else, but the very final thing when his wedding ring, she drops it and he realizes it's not on his finger, anymore. That whole scene beforehand was exactly talking about, hey, watch for the wedding ring. This is really important. So yeah, it was just full of that sort of thing.
Now, one more interesting change between interesting difference between the two design documents is the fact that in the first one, there's no romance in sight. Well, in the second one, there's an overtone of romance and sexual tension between the two leads. Was this something that you think would have appealed to Steven? Was it something that he asked for, that interpersonal connection between leads?
Well, I do remember quite clearly the first brainstorming meeting at the one we had at the ranch with both George and Stephen. That was just awesome for me. I mean, it's one thing being asked to be the project leader for the dig. When it was left to me to say, okay, no, you need to organize an initial brainstorming meeting. Stephen will be up and George wants to be in on the meeting. It's like, okay, run a creative meeting and try to creatively manage George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. And it was like, oh my God, how am I going to get through this? But happily, because they're, old friends, and, I realize now, having worked with quite a few billionaires, that they tend to trust the people they knew before they got rich, because they knew that they didn't, they're not just sucking up to them because they are rich. And in their particular case, of course, they both became rich around the same time and from some of the same movies. But they were joking with each other. And in particular, and there was nothing particularly confidential about this, but there was a whole side riff that we got into at one point where George was talking about a female character that, or was it Stephen that named her? So they named her Lips, sort of like, it was just, she was going to be a sort of a romantic interest, and they got into a talk about it. And then they sort of said, no, this is crazy. So what do we know? They were both at that point either already divorced, or one of them was getting divorced. The other had been divorced from Amy Irving and Marsha Lucas, respectively. So one of them said to the other, yeah, what do we know about women? And they just laughed about it. And I was just thinking, oh my God, I'm so privileged to kind of be in on these, seeing these guys act as friends and joking about these things. But the elements that had been proposed at that point, I mean, most of the games, the romantic elements were pretty minor. And certainly, at least in the games that we had done. And I just don't remember that ever being quite a major thing. It's like I would say the romance that developed between Guybrush and Elaine later on was probably the best LucasArts romance that kind of came out of all of this. We tried to do our best with Fate of Atlantis, but having four or five games to develop the Guybrush relationship as gave him a lot more room. So yeah, I don't remember them particularly pushing for or against it. It definitely kind of came up as a possibility. There's a bit of a romantic interest in the Forbidden Planet, but even by the early 80s, it felt pretty dated as a 1950s kind of view of damsel in distress stuff, and we definitely didn't want to do that.
Now, in the January 1991 design document, there's a whole section devoted to the... it's a very comprehensive puzzle list that enumerates all of the puzzles, and it stresses that the dig has to be non-linear to a large extent, and the cutscenes at the end of each puzzle would be independent. And I wonder where this idea came from, because up to that point, most of the Lucasfilm games, adventure games, were pretty linear. I mean, in Maniac Mansion, it's non-linear in the fact that you can choose different characters, and each one of them has their own skills. But at the end, you need to solve the same puzzles in the same order, pretty much. In Zack McCracken, the game is non-linear in the fact that you can travel to different places, but the puzzles themselves are there. And so it seems like you try to have a very ambitious story that needs to have an arc, but having so many puzzles be independent with relevant cutscenes. How did you see that unfold in the game? I mean,
I'm not sure that we ever had a coherent plan for it. I definitely remember part of what excited me about it, and when I said that there are elements that I would still want to use, that one of the things I enjoyed was an alien planet with different environments. There were basically 4 cities, main locations that we wanted to do that were each intentionally very different environments, different kind of puzzles in the different cities that were often adapted to the realities of the environment they're in. So, as we'll talk about the sort of ice and fire aspect of a volcanic mountains up high in a, imagine sort of Swiss Alps, but some of the mountains are volcanic, so you've got both fire and ice going on. A sunken city that I always had kind of imagined as, what would New York look like if the sea level rose, 20 feet, and a bunch of towers sticking out of the water. A desert one that you find early on where things are well preserved, and that's where some of the best clues can come from, but it's all desolate and very Tatooine-like. And then the last one, which is going to be a jungle environment. And then this is one of the things I remember Dave coming up with that I loved. There was something, I think it's called the Citadel in some of the documents. And then Dave said, well, what if it's actually a creature, a gigantic creature, and you have to go inside the creature? And that just opened up all sorts of ideas that these aliens had learned how to do genetic manipulation and had created this monstrous creature that was like genetically designed to be a castle. And inside, there would be smaller creatures that were sort of the immune system of this larger creature that now, 1,000 years later, had grown wild and were dangerous enemies you had to face, but they were, non-sentient. They were just, anyway, there's some elements I just thought were really fun. But again, it was like, wow, this is really trying to do a whole bunch of different stuff in one game. So if my version had survived, it would have only been possible, I think, to probably make it more linear than it was originally, as we actually figured out how to present the story in a way that made sense. But by starting with something as nonlinear as we can make it and compromising, I felt that we would get closer to something that had that kind of nonlinear, do anything in any order feeling as much of as was possible. And probably, I mean, the beginning has to be fairly linear. The very end has to be fairly linear. In between the two, you have room for diversion, which is exactly the structure we used for Fate of Atlantis.
Now, in the January 1991 design document, you start to see mechanics that almost feel RPG-like. So, for example, one character can repair the ship quickly thanks to prior experience, while the other has to find the manual first, and it takes longer for him or her to solve that puzzle, which uses, and he needs to consume more food in order to solve that puzzle because it takes him or her longer. And by contrast, in December 1990, each character from the ensemble of characters you had over there had specific skills. Like you had that mechanic and someone who's a botanic expert, but the puzzles themselves weren't described in terms of skills affecting the outcomes. So to me, it feels like the first draft leaned heavier into RPG territory, while the 1991 draft was more like Maniac Mansion, where different characters had, unique talents like Razor or Sid being able to play the piano, but it wasn't about stats or leveling up. Would you say that's accurate analogy of the design philosophy in both?
I think so. I mean, my memory of it, and again, it's with a grain of salt because this has been so long and I'm not sure this is exactly what I had in mind then, but what I think I was doing was, and when I say as I said, I was working a lot with Dave at that time. Joe Pinney, who was a part of the group, was contributing to some of our sessions, and there was a lot of collaboration. I'm sure Ron sat in on some of it, although he was busily working on, I think, Monkey 2 at that point. Anyway, or maybe it was actually Secret of Monkey Island 1 back then. Anyway, I wanted to do the sort of role-playing aspects in that first document, but when I started to think, how will this affect the puzzles, it was getting harder to reconcile the two of them and realize this was a point where the Ultima games were kind of the best known RPG style games out there. There have been so much that's done since then. It's a little hard to recall that, in the late 80s, there were not a huge number of examples, certainly not the kind of rich set of game mechanics and story elements and things that we're used to now. And what I tried to do, all along, there was this general sense of, wow, this is too ambitious. We can't afford to do this. It's going to take too long. And so I was constantly having to look to ways to rein in some of my initial concepts. And part of it was collapsing those into individuals. Part of it was coming up with actual mechanics that you actually had to eat in order to survive in this area. And the male character, who was the one who was mechanically inclined, had more trouble finding food. The female was a biology expert, and she knew which plants and animals, or she could figure out which ones were safe to eat and that sort of thing. But she couldn't fix things. He was having trouble getting food. And the idea was that as you play it through with one character or the other, you're constantly kind of being brought up short by what the other character can do. And that was also a reason to have to interact so that they could help each other, but also not trust each other that they were actually being helpful, or you're holding back from me, or, you've got plenty of food, why don't you give me some, that sort of thing. I'll give you some food if you fix this alien gadget for me.
And can you walk me through what the main gameplay loop looked like in your version of the dig? What would players actually be doing moment to moment?
Well, to the extent that I had it in mind, because we think about that sort of thing now, and we didn't, as far as I recall, talk about gameplay loops at the time, even though, the concept was kind of already pretty well known. But with adventure games, it's usually, solve this puzzle, go on to the next one, or sometimes solve one of these puzzles, and once you've done all of these puzzles, you can go on to the next area, that sort of thing. And so there was an element of that, but a lot of the puzzle solving was to uncover the very complicated story and to find out who the aliens were and to meet up with aliens and to figure out a way to bring aliens out of suspended animation, only to find out that it's actually a group of really bad aliens, and there are other aliens you have to find to help against, fight the mistake you've made. So there were definite linear story progressions that we would have had to filter in there. So you have to do A, then B, then C. But hopefully in between any of those nodes on the thing, you'd branch out into solving a bunch of other puzzles to kind of figure out the next stage. And the reality is it wasn't carefully thought out with all those aspects. And many of our games didn't. I remember the Monkey Island games, the first two Monkey Island games. There was a lot of adjustment. There were general story ideas, but a lot of it, particularly Monkey 2, I think, started before they knew exactly where it was going to end, and they kind of worked it out along the way.
Marvel movies are filmed the same way.
Yeah.
And Mission Impossible movies.
Yeah. To some extent, I think you have to change it as you go.
Except for the first Mission Impossible, which was directed by Brian De Palma.
Yeah. What a coincidence.
Now, you said that you're a fan of the Quest for Glory series, and I unfortunately never played any of them. And so
I didn't say I was a fan. I said that was Sierra's venturing into it. This is an interesting question. When did Quest for Glory 1 come out?
1989.
Okay. That's what I was remembering. So a lot of these ideas, did I even play that one, or did I just watch somebody else playing? It was not an established series when these ideas were coming up. So rather than be inspired by that, we were very competitive, as you've heard, with the Sierra folks, and having Spielberg and Lucas on our side, I just felt that we could definitely do something that would be a lot more sophisticated. That was also the Quest for Glory game, as I recall, had a very strong Dungeons and Dragons flavor. And it just happens that when I started playing role-playing games, it was in late 75. Dungeons and Dragons had come out just the year before, and a brand new game also put out by the same people. I don't think they were Wizards of the Coast yet, though. It was TSR at that point. Was Empire of the Petal Throne, and very obscure game.
Ooh.
So this is a newer reprint of the game booklet that it came with. And as it happens, it's set in the far future in a science fiction world where you're on an alien planet, but there is magic and a bunch of other sort of mystical aspects. And the guy who wrote all this stuff was a student of Eastern religions and Turkish lifestyle, and there are a whole bunch of elements that he borrowed from the culture of genies and that sort of thing, but mutating it. And it's a mix of science fiction and fantasy role-playing. And that was a game that I just really loved and never did anywhere near as well as Dungeons and Dragons, but it had been a strong influence on my creative thought. And at any rate, I was thinking more in this old ancient, in that particular world, you have ancient technology that you're finding that doesn't always work the way you expect it to, because the science fiction aspects, they had the story behind Empire of the Petal Throne is not unlike the story that I was creating for my version of the Dig. And maybe the success of Dungeons and Dragons, sort of shows that it was better to kind of go with something simpler and, more familiar to people than to be quite as outre as I was being.
So you weren't a fan of the Quest for Glory series or the first game. You just wanted to bring in that particular gameplay that Sierra
I was a fan of role-playing games,
yeah.
and I thought it was ripe. In fact, the Ultima series in particular, I was a big fan of those, and Ultima 4 in particular, I thought did a lot of what I hoped we would do, in that it tried to blur the lines between the character you were controlling and you, the player yourself, and that you had to make some decisions as a player that really were reflected in what the character did in the game, and vice versa. That just as an example, with Ultima 4, you say, I want to express generosity. Great. It's easy to press the generosity button. Or maybe it was selflessness. I forget exactly what the virtue was called. But in the game, you had to donate blood, which was basically losing hit points. So you actually had to show that you were being generous in a way that actually made your character weaker. And so it was true generosity. It wasn't just, oh, yeah, I've got a pile of gold, just have some. But wow, I really need this, but you can have some of it because you need it more than I do. And that really affected me, particularly thinking about a game where there's a betrayal aspect of it and a trust, and could we actually capture a feel for that? So it's not just the characters don't trust each other, but I, the player, don't trust this other character, and have it feel that way.
Now, I understand that other LucasArts employees didn't agree on the direction of that you had for the game of adding RPG elements. Now, since Ron Gilbert has a new RPG coming out called Death by Scrolling, I'm curious to know, back when you were working on the dig, did you ever get any input from him about the RPG elements?
Well, I don't recall, but Ron and I, after he left LucasArts and was running Humongous Entertainment, I worked with him on several RPG games. And we certainly had congruent ideas about what was interesting and fun. And Ron and I have worked on quite a few games that never got finished. Actually, it might be fun to do a mutual thing with him at some point. So no, I don't think he was one of the ones objecting to role playing. And it was, I don't know, it was complicated. There were a lot of egos involved. Something I learned from that project that I have tried to pass on to subsequent people is that working with Spielberg is wonderful. Working with the rest of your team members when they all want to impress Steven Spielberg is terrible. And the worst thing about it is that everybody in a chain above you in the company wants to get involved and wants face time with Steven Spielberg and wants to throw out some of their creative ideas, even though usually those people have absolutely no experience, creating games, just running the business. And boy, that really bothered me. And when Spielberg collaborated with EA, I talked to the people on those games. And in fact, one guy, and I'll leave him nameless, but I explained to him what I thought was going to happen and how he had to watch out. And so, no, don't worry, we've got this under control. Steve and I are getting along really well. I'm sure this is going to work. And that game never got released either because meddling at the higher levels, basically just kept yanking it around and saying, oh, no, I'm the head of the company and you need to do it that way. What do you think, Steven? Isn't that a cool idea? And it was a mess. So, and in fact, Robin Hunicke, who was a friend of mine at the time, working on a Spielberg game called Boom Blocks, that was the sort of secondary game that EA was doing, and they didn't care that much about it, which was a blessing for her because they didn't get involved with screwing around with it, and the game actually came out and was pretty successful.
And during the production of your version of the dig, were there any discussions about how the soundtrack should sound? Was there talk about whether it should be, CD audio or MIDI?
I'm sure that must have come up, but we had such a great sound team. The three guys who are still friends. I just had lunch with them a couple months ago, who were our iMUSE team and did all the software and composed the music in our games. We were so impressed by them. I think everybody in the company just thought they were great, and I knew that they would have the capability of, both technically doing whatever state of the art was, because this was a turbulent time with different sound cards, and most of the sales were on IBM PC compatibles, and there were at that point at least 3 or 4 different popular sound cards, and you had to support all of them if you wanted to. But I just knew that these guys, they would handle all those issues, and we never got to the point of actually trying to compose the feeling and how the theme would go, but I was sure that they were going to handle it no problem.
And I know that the close-ups and the cutscenes in the final game were added to match what players expected in 1995, because the game at that point looked like a 1992-ish game.
Yeah.
So they added the cutscenes and the close-ups to make it seem more in line with what Full Throttle that came out 7 months prior to that looked like. Not in terms of sprites, because there were smaller sprites, in terms of cutscenes. But back in 1991, what were the cutscenes planned to look like? I mean, how cinematic could they realistically be with the technology that was available back then?
Well, early on, not in my version, but I think certainly in Brian's version, ILM got involved, and they said, we can do that sort of stuff. It's going to be really expensive, but then there was that whole thing. And they did do some of the more impressive things for the Dig, although they were really impressive by the standards of like 1993 when they did them, and not so much by, the time a couple of years later when the game was released, because technology had moved so quickly. It was... I mean, these are really interesting questions in retrospect, but at the time, at least from what I can remember, it was much more of an organic process. And rather than saying we need to make more of these linear cutscenes because this is what state of the art is, it was how can we do something cool and impressive that people haven't seen before, or more of what people have only seen little bits of, that sort of thing. And we were constantly just trying to gradually grow the range of what was possible and what you could do. I mean, it's interesting just seeing the latest Indiana Jones game. I was constantly shocked because the part of me that was still back in 1990, it was like thinking, by the year 2060, maybe we'll be able to do something like that. And the fact that it was so, close to photorealistic, but with so much control from the player. And it just, the whole industry keeps moving faster, I think, than we game developers have expected. That maybe finally is slowed down to the point where we're not seeing as much of it these days. But this may just be a bit of a pause before, augmented reality games with a brainwave headset that, Elon Musk's Neurable or no, whatever, that it'll plug it into your brain and you'll just think the game. Maybe we'll have that in 5 years and things will change again.
And when Moriarty's version of the Dig was announced, LucasArts made a point of saying that it would be released on both floppy and CD. Was your version also planned for both, or were you aiming for CD only at the time?
Boy, that's a good question. I think it was CD. It's certainly in early 91. It was yet to be seen whether that was going to be the main thing or just kind of a gimmick. Loom was our first experiment with using CDs at all, and the first one was just as an audio CD. Not having the dialogue audio. And when we did Fate of Atlantis 2 years later, we did the disc-based version and the CD talkie didn't come out until later. So as far as I recall, there was an awareness that CD would be possible, but I don't think we got anywhere close to a decision of, how to do that. Now, had my version gone ahead and, released in 93 or so, I would assume we would have been pushing to have it on CD at that point. But, it wasn't a factor in the early design stages because we didn't have to worry about what you were going to distribute it on. The games were developed on the computers that we had in the big disk drives and not on floppy disks or CDs. That was one of the last steps you did.
In terms of timing, it was the Loom CD that came out in 1992, and Fate of Atlantis, the floppy, also came out in 1992, but the CD version came out in 1993.
Well, we were experimenting. I mean, another thing that I remember doing in my version of the Dig is we did our first rotoscope tests, and the two main characters, once we had that established, ended up Joe Penny did the male guy, and Lucy Bradshaw did the female character. And we went out, and this would have been in 91 or so. We went in the parking lot of where our games group was at that point. It was after we outgrew Skywalker Ranch and had to move back to San Rafael, Kerner Boulevard, and had them walk through the parking lot in costume, as it were. Joe was wearing an old poncho that I just threw away a couple of years ago, with some white stripes added to it because we wanted to get the sense of fabric that had never been done in games before, that would wrinkle and change as you walked. Lucy was in a spacesuit, which was basically a wetsuit that we contributed, and I still am grateful for her to go through the really uncomfortable process of putting on a wetsuit and walking around in the sunlight, sweating underneath it, just to get the walk cycles in. But then we had our art group take the video we had shot and freeze frame each frame and draw on top of it. And it worked really well. It ended up getting used quite a bit later on, particularly for the fabric of the suit Joe was wearing. I remember people gasping because it was, wow, this looks so real, because you could see up to that point, the animators had drawn the clothes in and maybe there'd be a little bit of motion, but you could actually see the reflections of light off of this. And it felt so much more. It was just an early stage of what's obviously much more impressive these days, but that was one of the early tests that we did.
Wow. Do you think these VHS tapes or the sprites themselves are available or currently in the LucasArts archives?
I doubt it. I mean, so much of this stuff has in the moves that they did when they moved to the Presidio in particular, they threw away huge amounts of stuff. And a lot of the pieces that you've seen of my version of the Dig are only there because those of us that worked on it, and really, it's like the artwork that Larry Ahern did. I didn't even know it had survived, but he had kept copies of it and, eventually distributed those. I still have, I haven't mentioned this to many people, but I guess it's okay to talk about it without releasing it. But the brainstorming meeting that had me, Ron Gilbert, I think Doug Glenn, and Steven Spielberg, that we did at Spielberg's home office in LA. I have a cassette tape of that. And and then I have not ever published it. I did digitize it at one point, although it was far enough back that when I tried to play it recently, my computer couldn't recognize it, but I'm sure it's just because it's an old audio format. At least the bits are safe. And I think I still have the cassette, but it may have degraded by now. So that was really fun, just to have some bits and pieces that we saved from those things. And I may have mentioned this to you before. I've talked about it in several interviews, but one of my proud moments with Spielberg was when we had that meeting at his home office, so he had a place. He still has it. It survived the big fires recently in Pacific Palisades. I didn't see the main. Well, I saw the main house, but we went and worked in his office, which was basically a little separate building just on the grounds there, and on a desk with a big computer set up. There were all sorts of our games on the walls. I was really happy about that. And there were 3 books on the desk. Let's see, what was it? The Color Purple, Jurassic Park, both books that he had turned into movies. But on top of those, well thumbed and wrinkled, was a Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe manual. And it was like, oh, well, that's the one he needs to reference all the time. And also after those meetings, when I was at 3DO a couple of years later, Trip Hawkins, the founder of 3DO, the founder before that of Electronic Arts, was at I think it was a Consumer Electronics show. I think it was before E3, or maybe it was one of the early E3s, and met with Spielberg. And Spielberg, a friend of mine who was there, said, "Oh, this is a great new system you're doing. You should hire Ron Gilbert and Noah Falstein. Those guys know more about games than anything else." And Trip had already hired me and didn't tell Spielberg that. And the guy who told me about this said, "Trip must have told you that, right?" And he said, "No." And that we realized later that Trip was kind of miffed that he finally gets to meet Spielberg, and Spielberg was more excited about somebody who worked for Trip than meeting Trip himself. So that was another little, and the fact that I knew that Stephen thought that way of the work that I had done, it's one of my very proudest moments.
And this was after the dig was canceled, your version?
Well, after my version was canceled. Yeah, it was actually, I think, before the final version came out. And as I understand it, talking to Brian and to a lesser extent to Sean, I was the only one who actually got to have all those face-to-face meetings. I think he reviewed some of the stuff that happened later, but he didn't do. He might have actually done a phone conversation with Brian. Now that I think about it, but all that happened after I was out of the company, so I don't really remember the.
He sent them a letter saying thanks for the dig. At the end,
okay,
that's all they got.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Sean gave the previous 3 project leaders the credit "Ghosts of Dig Past," which is okay. But what miffed me a little bit wasn't about me, but Brian. I would say 80 to 90% of the story that's in the final dig was Brian's story and Brian's concept. And he deserved more credit than, Ghosts of Dig Past. Sean got it over the goalpost, so to speak, but there was a lot of Brian's version in there. Dave's version, he was only on the project for a few months, I think, so he didn't have a chance to steer it too much and he was smart enough to kind of get out from the controls of this beast that was lumbering towards publication.
And was Brian miffed about the fact that he didn't get credit? I mean, you're miffed about it for him.
I am. In the few times that I talked to him about it, said that he was not, that it's, hey, I've let go of that. I don't care. But, I don't know whether that was him being more munificent about it or whether he absolutely felt that way. I would think, knowing Brian, he also quoted, I think this is from some lyrics of a song, but he said, you can't bask in somebody's shadow. And in the sense that Spielberg's shadow was over the dig, having his name associated. If it succeeded, it was like, how did that Noah Falstein guy screw it up? Sorry, if it failed, how did that Noah Falstein guy screw it up? If it succeeded, it's like, oh, well, of course, Steven Spielberg is fantastic. He can do video games. And there's a lot of truth in that insight. You have to be careful about that sort of thing.
Okay, let's review some of Anson Drew's animations for your version.
Oh, good. This is stuff that probably haven't seen in all these years. Oh, yes.
All these six-legged creatures.
Yep. Oh, actually, in that last one, I think was Major Tom, the human, or at least it was based on the concept that there's big flying creature comes in and scoops him up.
So this is Major Tom?
I don't know. I mean, it looks like it just a
his
little
arms.
I don't know what's going to. Well, it certainly looks more like a biped, but it doesn't look quite like a person. So maybe that was just meant to be hunting. I really liked the idea of 6 limbs because it allowed us to have a lot of different types of creatures, centaur-like creatures, dragons that had a set of wings but also 4 legs, or dragons that could have a pair of legs to stand on, a pair of wings to fly, and a pair of hands. Just opened up all sorts of really interesting possibilities. And I had also been impressed by Larry Niven's book, The Mote in God's Eye, where the creatures were asymmetrical and they had one big, strong right arm and 2 more lithe left arms. And many of the creatures on that planet had that same kind of asymmetry. But the sort of evolutionary tracing it back to one ancestor and having them diversify into a lot of different forms, that was one of the pieces I really enjoyed. And Terry Whitlatch, our artist who did the aliens and came up with some of the concepts for these creatures, she is amazing and would, you talk about the kind of creature you wanted to do, and she would literally start with a skeleton and figure out what would its skeleton be like, and if it had 4 legs and 2 arms, how would they kind of fit together on the spine, and how would it walk, and would it have a different gait like horses do when it goes faster? She just sort of figured out all that stuff, and there was some animation of those guys that happened after these ones you're showing me.
So these are all the animations that survived from your version. Mm-hmm. So we have just 4 animations.
Yeah. And that one is closer, but not quite the same as the final intelligent aliens.
Wait, what happens to it at the end? If you look, it's walking and then something, whoop, is it flying? Is it
it jumps,
morphing
to get
something?
Off of it looked to me like it was just jumping off the screen. And yeah, this is very weird. I can't tell what that is. I guess it's
maybe
not
it's
a person.
Bob in Threadbare, and that's the dragon.
It could be.
Grabbing him.
Could be.
Now, let's also look at some concept art. There's tons of concept art from all of the various versions, but this concept art over here. Whoop.
Oh, there we go. That's where it starts to get to be my era.
Yep.
Yeah, I loved the idea of that wasn't really explored thoroughly in Forbidden Planet. A lot of the alien stuff was in pristine working condition, and I kind of love the idea of it all being broken down and the jungles having overgrown it for, I don't think we ever settled on whether it had been 100 years or 1,000 years. It was somewhere in that kind of range, and that if it was 100 years, it seemed like it was too recent and they'd still be around. But if it was 1,000 years, it was kind of hard to believe that all the machinery would still be working. And we were, in general debating that, but I think we just decided to leave it fairly ambiguous.
Well, it's a concept that, Lucas also used in the first Star Wars. The idea of having a used future and not make everything look as if it was just installed and never used.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember being very impressed by that when the first movie came out. Yeah, these are some of the different cities. This was the desert city. You land outside of the city, but then come in and explore some of these buildings. And the characters would walk around on this long view, and when they go into a building, then you'd cut to being inside, like the earlier one you saw there.
So each one of these buildings is accessible? was supposed to be accessible?
If I remember correctly, that particular screen, some of this was just concept art and it wasn't based on any of the puzzles we had. So it was more like draw an alien city and we'll think about it. This one, I think, was a maze of sorts where if you go into one door, you come out another, kind of like what we did in Fate of Atlantis. But it never got implemented, so I don't know if that was what we would have ended up doing in the final run. There was a nice organic thing, in the city by the water in particular, I think had a lot more organic elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
This was, I think, one of the more thought out puzzle areas. So this is the city in the mountains, the ice mountains, but there were volcanoes. So you had, most of it was frozen, but then you get into some areas and there's, I don't think we had lava, but we had a lot of pools of hot water and geysers and that sort of thing. And I am not recognizing that. That looks like it was based on working on one of our puzzles as some kind of control panel, but I don't recall that. Oh, and it's just so there was a lot of stuff that I did. This was a room that I think we actually wired at some point or did a very early version of that where you could walk around, but you're having trouble getting from the left side to the right side. There's that ledge on the left. And that may have been developed in the later pictures that I think we'll see in a bit. Oh, interesting. Gosh, yeah, some of the stuff I haven't seen and what is it now? These 35 years or so.
Well, that's why I'm here.
I appreciate it. Gosh, I'm just not remembering a lot of this stuff. And some of it may be, this was the start of the game where you're in a spaceship that touches down before Major Tom. That was just a working name, by the way. We just threw some names in there. Ron was always much better at coming up with names for characters and things at the beginning that just stuck and everybody was happy with them. But these were a couple different views of the spaceship. The one on the left, I think, was the one we used for some tests. And when I mentioned having Joe in the poncho walking around, we hooked it up to having somebody walking from that ramp that's opened in the front of the spaceship.
I mean, you could have left the Major Tom name in the game, and then since it's a LucasArts game, maybe they could have licensed Space Oddity for the credit sequence.
Could be. It's surprising how if they hear that Lucasfilm was licensing it, they ask for a lot of money. And likewise, the Lucasfilm people say, no, you're getting such great publicity. So you get into those battles. Oh, yeah. And this was something Larry just came up with. This wasn't based on any specific idea. We just we had a fly cycle thing, which I think was a human ship for getting around quickly. And at some point, there was some discussion about what if the aliens, because the four cities are in very different geographic areas, so we needed to be able to kind of zip around have a plausible reason why you could easily get from one to another. And we were talking about different types of transport for that. I like this, and he did a ship as well, I think.
So the alien vehicle worked perfectly?
Well, as I said, we had a conflict of wanting stuff to work, but also wanting stuff to look really old. And also because you find and resuscitate aliens, there was always, again, we hadn't worked out the details. It may be that you need to have one of them fix it, or get it back in working shape. It is something, a lot of the Planet of the Apes movies take a lot of liberties with ancient stuff working perfectly well. There's a lot of debate about if our whole civilization collapsed, tomorrow, how much would still be around in 100 years or 1,000 years. And nobody really knows. And I've seen a lot of different speculations, some in some movies and certainly a lot of books. There's some of the more organic stuff. Yeah, the water city, we were looking for ways to getting out to the buildings that were out in the middle of the water because the sea level had rose.
So you had to use different types of vehicles. You had to use this vessel and that vehicle to...
I don't think it ever got to the point of knowing exactly how they'd be used. A lot of these things. Here we go. There's one of the alien views, although this, I think, was probably Larry's version after Terrell did her first pass.
This is the Aboriginal costume, intelligent aliens.
Okay. Well, that is, so there were a group, I think those were the good aliens that were still around, but in a kind of primitive state. And then there were the bad guys who were in suspended animation that you wake up. Yeah. There we go. This is Terry's original drawings. And there's something very plausible about it. I mean, you could, even in just these still pictures, you can almost imagine it walking. And it looks human-like enough. I love the staff, the walking stick, and this little critter, six-legged critter zipping off. It has 4 running legs and 2 forelegs that I forget. There was she had worked out what those 4 legs were used for. There were some, maybe it was grabbing their prey.
And it has a backpack.
Yeah.
And Terrell ended up working on Jar Jar Binks a few years later.
Yeah, she did a lot of stuff. I mean, we also had Ian McKegg, who did a lot of our game work, went on. He designed many of the prequel trilogy characters, the Queen Amidala look, and what's his name, the devil horn guy, Darth Maul.
Darth Maul, right.
But yeah, it was very nice to have the people who had worked on games be recognized for being, quality to, oh, there we go. Yeah, she was such an amazing artist for what we were looking for, because, particularly when I saw her thinking about the skeletons and how they would work and everything, I thought this is exactly the kind of science fiction feel I was looking for.
Now, one thing that's not apparent from all of the concept art is the color palette you were going for. Futuristic movies tend to have a bluish tint to them. Sometimes in the desert, you have an orange tint. Nowadays, all of the action movies have a blue and orange tint.
Yeah, not just... I've been talking to my wife about that. If you watch... There's a comedy TV series called AP Biology that clearly is just making fun of that. I mean, everything is aggressively, every single costume background is orange or blue or some shade of those two, but just way over the top. And yeah, there's a lot of people in Hollywood that have gotten tired of that. I mean, it's interesting seeing the background you have behind your head right now that has a bit of that orange and blue thing going on.
Well, it's from The Dig.
Yep. Well, that's the thing. I mean, I understand the reasons why, having things on opposite sides of the color palette really makes them pop. And the orange shades can be close to a range of human skin shades, more so than green or yellow or, a bunch of other ones. And so that's very frequently used.
So was this the color palette you were going for?
I was not going for a specific color palette. I don't have any memory of getting to that level. I do remember that one of the reasons for the 4 different environments, particularly the Citadel beast and having that be all inside a creature, that was obviously going to be much more reds and browns and kind of organic stuff that looks like you were inside the belly of the beast. But I think aside from wanting to have different ones and leaving it to the artists to, help pick appropriate themes, I don't remember.
We also have this background by Peter Chan. It was part of seems like a giant circular room of sorts.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't recall that. I wonder if so there were puzzles, the one I referred to earlier that involved a water and ice thing. They used a very similar thing. I wonder whether this was an early version of that, because there were pipes that you would end up crawling through, like the ones on the upper left of these images. Mm-hmm. And there were ventilation pipes. And one of the things that I had as the puzzle is that you could get into the ventilation pipe, go through, and there was a grill, and you couldn't get through there, but you can see into a room that you knew you wanted to get into. So it was a way, it was actually using some of Ron's ideas of not having backwards puzzles. It's like you want to see why you want to break through the door before you start to care about breaking through the door. And yet, how do you see what's on the other side of the door? And well, my idea was that if we give you a way to kind of look into the room, but you see that the door that you can't open, well, if you could figure out how to open it, to get to the door and open it, then you get this wonderful, that was where the aliens were in suspended animation, I think was going to be happening that way.
It seems like you needed to get up to the ceiling because you had things on the ceiling, like rotate the room or something.
This does not look like, I wonder whether this might have even been one of Brian's iterations that as he was evolving, the very different look that he used. And I could see from the pictures on the right that it looks like they had already started to turn this into a full scum room and have those be things that might be overlaid on some other parts of the screen. Although I'm not sure if those fit; those might just have been paintings. Yeah, this was the ice and water puzzle. One of the many. This was the most developed puzzle we had. You see, it has those same kind of ribbed tubes, and one of those, as I say, you crawl through and can see where you need to go. This one, there was a trickle. There was a way of starting a trickle of hot water from one of the geysers. And once I forget what the puzzle was, once you complete the puzzle, it trickles down that open ramp that you see just to the bottom of the screen. And I think there are some screens that show a stream of water there that you might have.
That white orb is just the flash of someone taking a photo.
Oh, I was wondering. I don't recall that at all, but that makes more sense. Yeah, that's about where the source of the water comes from. I forget exactly how.
Someone took a photo of a computer screen, and you see the flash on the screen. Now, here's some concept art you sent me yesterday. Let's see if we went over everything.
So this was called the Funhouse. That became the Citadel beast when Dave had his stroke of genius of having it be a living creature that's still alive after all these years. That's also, here we go. So this is, so this on the left, you can crawl into that pipe and go all the way through. And you're on the left side of the screen, but there's a gulf, obviously, that you can't go across. And on the right side, you see that there's when you go through that pipe, you see into a room that is just beyond the rooms you're seeing here, that's full of stuff you want to get to. And so you come back out and you can fill that gap with water by starting the stream that I mentioned that trickles down, and you can see the different things on the right side of how it fills up the gap in successive screens there. And, so it goes from right to left, it goes more and more full. And what happens is you have the hot water coming in and it fills it all up. And if you then shut off the water, you're up in the mountains where everything's frozen, and that water gradually freezes. And then, gradually meaning you come back to it and now it's frozen over. And now you can walk across and get to the other side. And then later, it turns out that you need to unfreeze it. So you go back and you unstick the hot water running down. And after, again, letting the hot water hit the ice for a while, it's all melted. and then you pull the plug at the bottom. I forget exactly how we figured out how to do that. Maybe you get underneath it and you empty the water out again. But it was one of those things where I think Ron and I talked a lot about this, of some of the best solutions to puzzles are when they use things that people are familiar with. The concept of, stuff freezing or melting, and the idea that, well, this is hot water and it's not going to freeze. Well, it will if you're in a freezing cold room. So if you shut off the inflowing hot water, then you can, just wait and it will turn into ice. And that whole process, it gives players the chance to kind of have that aha moment of figuring out how it all works.
Well, it's no surprise that Ron liked a puzzle that has melting in it, because his favorite puzzle from The Secret of My Calendar is the one in which Guybrush has to take grog from the scum bar and pass it through a couple of mugs, because each one of them melts until you get to the prison and break Otis out.
I didn't know that was his favorite. I remember as that was coming up, it was kind of closely allied to the recipe for grog and all of the caustic things that, as I'm sure you heard, there was some South American TV show that got a hold of the instructions for making grog and took it seriously and thought, this is a terrible thing. They're telling people to drink acid. This is reprehensible.
Well, this one's on them.
Yeah.
No one should drink acid. It's common sense. So this,
at any rate, yeah.
This room looks like the library in the final game.
I don't recall exactly how it was set up. It was definitely, a room that it had been a domed room that the ceiling had fallen in and this plant had grown. And I'm not sure whether it was supposed to still be alive or just a dead stump at that point. And this was a alien daycare center, and there's a little toy version. It's like this was a Ken Macklin drawing. I remember that. What would a version of this creature? You see a full-sized one in the background. That's kind of a statue, but it's also a slightly cartoon-like version. And on the lower left, it's kind of the equivalent of a Barbie doll. It's a little creature that's meant to be a stylized version of one of the intelligent aliens.
Looks like a Barney doll.
Yes, yeah. Barney was hot right at that point, so that's quite possible. That was part of the inspiration. Yeah, and I don't remember. This was that Aborigine that you meet. I think it might have been. This is the hut that he lived in, with some cooking implements outside, and it looks like it's some kind of giant cactus and a door that opens and closes. That's what you see off on the side there.
So this overlay is supposed to be placed when he's not cooking, and this one is... I think
so, yeah. And then it opens it up and he brings the stuff out. Yeah, I don't remember what the story element of that was. And this was an early take on that Citadel beast idea, but unfortunately, I think that came up towards the end of our collaboration on it, and we never got to do the full detailed characters that we wanted to do. Oh yeah, here's the water frozen and melted, and this is a close up, I think, of that room when you got down to being able to walk across it.
So this one's when it's water, and this one when it's frozen.
Yes,
that's an awesome puzzle.
Thank you. Yeah, there we go. That's that same area that we were talking about with the water trickling.
From Ken Macklin's photo, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and here's a close-up of the landing leg and exit ramp for the spaceship. I like the fact that there are stairs built into the leg. This is a very clever way of doing it. And then, of course, Doctor Who shows up in his TARDIS, and we have to put that in there.
We've seen this.
Yep.
Let's see if we missed any. See, you also have these in your files.
Yeah, well, I got them just because Larry had put them online at one point. That was, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
So we went over all of these.
Yeah.
And one interesting document he shared with me yesterday was the work assignment chart, which was extremely interesting.
Well, that might have been one of the last things that was done before they realized that this was going to be too expensive. A lot of it was, not certain how many rooms we'd need and what we would do. And as you could see from the names, there was more that had been thought out than I had written about. That I think there were other documents or, just we talked about some of those happening to try and get a sense of how much art and scripting time we needed, because that was generally, 90% of the cost of developing these games.
So what you're saying is that they saw the numbers and freaked out?
That's my memory. And as I say, I mean, I'm really not being, humble about it. In looking back at the story, I just feel like, if I were today being pitched this game, I would say, this is way too complex a story, and it's a little bit too intellectual. There's some exciting elements, but I would have probably rejected it. And I don't recall, and I wasn't in on the meetings that the people in charge of the company were having, when they made this call. So I don't know what their decisions were about, but it felt that I had disappointed them. And as I recall, what was the sequence? You might even know this better than I did, but I think that I was taken off the project. There was a short period where I was a producer on Day of the Tentacle that, I'm uncredited for because I didn't, it was just really, I don't know, maybe 2 months. And I remember that chiefly because being in on brainstorming meetings with Ron, Dave, and Tim was just, it was fun. People would get really upset because we were laughing too loud and they wanted to all be in on it. But a lot of those time travel things in Day of the Tentacle, it was just really fun coming up with different types of puzzles you could do with traveling backwards and forwards in time. But I did that for a little while. I was working with Hal a lot on Fate of Atlantis. I don't really remember, and unfortunately I didn't keep a very accurate. I wish I had done what Ken Macklin did and showed when you interviewed him and had all those extensive notes, because it just, a lot of this stuff is a blur to me now.
Well, the first thing I asked him was on what date was the dig canceled, was your version of the dig canceled.
Yeah, and he knew exactly.
And that was June 26th, 1991.
Yeah, and it was, let's see, 7 months before I was then laid off. But in between those two events, there was a change in management at LucasArts, and I think the new management was under pressure to cut back on cost overruns, which may have been part of what happened with the dig anyway. And they laid off about 10% of the company, and unfortunately, I was one of the highest ranked people who was caught in that.
Now I see here that the estimate total days of scripting to do is 257 days. So for one scripter with a 5-day work week, get a year of scripting and more than a year for one artist. And you had four scripters, 4 artists working on it.
Yeah, well, I think that was a proposal. I don't believe that Joe did much. Joe or Sean did much work on those things. By that point, it was mostly Dave and myself. I don't recall how much of this was speculative and how much of it was based on. You can see past 2 masters, so there must have been a past 1. And maybe there were subsequent ones, and this is just one of the few that I managed to find. Unfortunately, some of those early files were in formats that current computers don't read very well. This one, because I could tell it was supposed to be a spreadsheet, I stuck an XLS file type on it, and then Excel brought it up, no problem. But when I just tried to open it, it said unrecognized, don't know how to open this.
And what was Sean's role in
I think that was more, if I had Sean, he'd put in this amount of time or that sort of thing. I'm actually not sure
if
what
Sean
those
would have
numbers
worked on this version, I think he would be more emotionally attached to it than I
don't recall him being significantly involved with this version. It's just that he was somebody who was in the group of scumlets who were working on a lot of the games, and and there was obviously, as you've uncovered, there was some controversy of the people that wanted to be promoted to be a project leader and have their own concept, and quite understandably, I mean, that was how the rest of us had kind of gone up the ranks, just making our games from the beginning. It was nice to have come in the early 80s, as I did, when everybody kind of got to make their own game, at least as a chance to sort of show they knew what they were doing.
Now, I noticed there are multiple entries labeled as pseudo rooms, things like the zoo interior and the fast food area.
Yeah. Oh, God, what was that? That was a specific type of scum thing we did.
I mean, were these non-interactive backgrounds, kind of like that transitional room that was cut from, The Secret of Monkey Island before Guybrush gets to the cannibals' village?
I really don't recall. I do remember, it's funny you just said that, and it just flashed as I suspect Ron or certainly Eric Wilmunder would be able to tell you right away. It was, I think, a way of, as with most of these things, was either making it seem like a room when it was really just a variation on an existing one, or I don't recall. It must have been some way to save memory space, because as I said, this was being developed when we still were using floppy disks, and we were already reaching that point where it was too many floppy disks, it was eating into our profit margins. But in order to make a game that was big enough to please the players, they wanted more and more. And very few people, if any, had CD-ROM drives when the design here was done. By the time the game was released, it was much different.
Certain scripters are paired with certain artists. Do you remember how those pairings were decided? Was
no.
Based on, personal chemistry?
I don't know whether that was decided or whether it was just an arbitrary thing I did for estimates. And in many cases, not to say that everybody was interchangeable, but it was hard to estimate. I mean, still it's hard to estimate just how long it will take to do any of these jobs when the full design isn't complete. And I was maybe being over optimistic at how quickly a lot of the stuff could be done.
And when it came to the art itself, was there any conscious choice behind choosing specific artists for specific things, for example?
Yeah, well, in a lot of cases, we had asked different artists to do some concept sketches, and some of the people were better at, there was definitely a mix of people who were primarily environment artists and doing the rooms themselves, and animators who were good at animating characters. So that was one of the easier things. Anson did a lot of animation, and that was his specialty.
And Larry was more of a character focused animator, and Armand was a background artist.
Yeah, he and I didn't work together that much, and he did a few of the pieces of artwork, but I think he had just come on board shortly before the dig came up.
Now, in the final version of the game, the shovel solves quite a lot of puzzles. How much digging was in your version of the dig?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Very little, actually, now that I think about it. I mean, calling it a dig was, that was an archaeological term. That was actually Spielberg's concept right from the beginning. He came to us with that name. But particularly, well, let's see, there's a lot of digging in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and none at all that I can remember in Forbidden Planet. So I don't know. Maybe I just figured it was optional, shovel optional.
I mean, if you play the final version of Dig, you notice that the shovel solves way too many puzzles. I don't think there's any other inventory item in any other LucasArts game that you can use so much on so many things on screen, and that would actually solve a puzzle and not just, get a funny response from the main character.
Well, I did play through the final version of the Dig, and I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. I feel like the puzzles were one of its weaker parts. As I said, I think Brian's story, which was mostly intact, and the character interactions, and the kind of ethereal alien thing that he did, which was very different than my much more concrete aliens. It was all a really interesting direction and had more of an artistic vision, I think, than I would have expected. But the puzzles, and particularly, like many people, I got rather frustrated with the skeleton that you have to put together. But I also know how hard it is to make these puzzles, and particularly with that 40 hours of gameplay thing, there's a tendency to say, yeah, this is probably too hard, but better to have too many hours, because with Loom in particular, we got so many angry people because they had finished the game in just a few hours. So we were very sensitive and about that time to add more complexity. And it's such a shame, because games like Loom, I think, Loom would be a perfect indie game if it came out, in current day and more sophisticated format.
I mean, to me, the puzzles in the final game felt kind of standalone. They weren't the usual dialogue or inventory puzzles, except from the fact that you can use the shovel on everything and solve that puzzle. But it was more like the Seventh Guest, where you solve each puzzle without any prior knowledge or any other thing. And then you're rewarded with a cutscene or an item. And so when it came to your vision of the Dig, how did you envision the puzzles? Were they mainly inventory, apart from the thing that we saw in the design document? Did you envision them to be more dialogue puzzles, more inventory puzzles?
Well, as I said, in most of the cases, it was combination of inventory, not a lot of dialogue puzzles, at least not to the extent that I had ever done them. It might have come up later if we kept going. But inventory puzzles, the more elaborate one that I mentioned was probably the best thought out, with the freezing water and everything. I don't recall the details. I remember there were several inventory items you needed to get in order to turn the water on and off and figure out, where it was. And I tried to make that as plausible and logical as it could be. Ron and I in particular have talked endlessly about how to balance out a sort of logic and, well, obviously in his cases with humor as well, where sometimes, the infamous monkey wrench puzzle, you'll get things that only make sense as a joke, really. We won't get into that particular one, but I wanted this, part of the injection of role playing was because it had been proven that people enjoy games where you have to, I'm running out of food, I need to go gather some more food, or I need the engineer to repair this for me, because if I do it, it's going to take longer, and then I'll run out of food, and that sort of thing. And the economy of all of that type of a system in the game puzzle is something that I find interesting. I wish you're assuming that I had a lot more in mind and high level control, and that's how I would approach it today, and it's how we look at games today. And a lot of this was much more seat of the pants still, even at that stage of LucasArts growth.
You talked about the skeleton puzzle and the fact that, probably by the end of development, they realized, or playtesters told the developers, that it's way too complicated. And then they added the fossil with some other artist. That's why it looks vastly different in terms of style than the actual puzzle.
I didn't notice that.
So you mentioned that you didn't like that puzzle. Most people didn't. But you said in the past that you would have redesigned it differently, like built up the complexity more gradually. How would you have created this puzzle? Because, it's based on a Brian Moriarty puzzle. When I talked to Anson Chu, we looked at, concept art of the original skeleton puzzle, which was supposed to be the main character, let's call him Boston, would go around and pick up the bones from different locations and then would assemble that skeleton. So in Sean's version, it was, let's say, easier because all the bones are there. You just need to rearrange them. But if you had to design a similar puzzle, how would you do it?
Oh, it's an interesting one. Trying to think of other puzzles that I've designed that had similar qualities. Maybe the 3 stones in Fate of Atlantis, and certainly Hal had a lot to do with that as well. But I remember some discussions about how people would figure out how to use them and the correspondence between the symbols on the stones and the solutions that were kind of given as almost as poetry, and you had to interpret what that meant, of which sunset to line up with sunset or sunrise, and the various elements of that. It's something we're putting them together, having concentric ones where it's smaller. Part of that is just people's intuition in physics. You might not know where bones go, but if you see 3 discs of different sizes, you naturally put the bigger one at the bottom. That's the kind of thing I like to do when I can. And with what you described, I would say, one way is to break them down into different pieces so that you might assemble a skull separately from other body parts, and that there are more references, again, hieroglyphics on a wall or something you could find that would give you you might be able to do it by trial and error, but if you don't, you might be able to find hieroglyphics that you realize are an abstract way of corresponding to that are giving instructions to a degree. And as anybody's who's assembled something from IKEA knows, even having the instructions, it may be a bit of a puzzle to figure out how to make it work. And something that I learned from Ron and Dave and I in particular working together on our games, of starting with something really simple, and if it's too easy, adding a little more complication. And it might be, for example, that putting the pieces together of the bones is pretty easy and straightforward, but finding the bones in the first place is not. And that would fit in well, that if you could tell which ones were missing by some kind of impressions that they had left in the dirt or something, so that hey, I've got 3 of the 5 pieces, that's great. Oh, I've got the 4th one. Where's that 5th piece? I've got to find it. When you finally find it, it's really exciting and satisfying. If you don't know how many pieces you need, and each time you come back, you see whether you've got it, it's not as exciting as the anticipation is actually part of the pleasure. And so setting it up so that that you're getting closer and closer to the finale is a great way of building people's excitement. You can also, having done that, all that it does is takes you to the next stage, and it's like, oh my God, now there's even more going on. But that in many games, I remember one of my all-time favorite games is Portal, and somebody told me that there were like 17 levels, and I remember playing it and getting through like the first 10 levels in, 2 hours, and thinking, oh, this is really too bad. I'm going to be finished with this game in another hour or two. And you get to the last 2 or 3 levels, and they just are so much bigger than the previous ones. But it had that kind of feeling, oh, I'm almost there. It's like, oh my God, now I need to do this. How am I even going to get across this room? That kind of feeling, I think, is what a good designer really looks for.
You were not thinking with portals in mind. in those last couple of levels. I think one of the main problems with that puzzle, apart from the fact that, what we've just discussed, is I like to watch people on Twitch play the game for the first time, because I like to see the authentic reaction of someone experiencing the game for the first time in 2025. And one of the things that always comes up is the fact that up to that point, you never use the right click on your mouse in the game. In that puzzle, you need to use the right click to rotate the bones. But when you play the game, you just downloaded it on Steam, never used the right mouse click, it can take you several minutes until you figure it out. Most people just, open up a walkthrough.
Yeah. Well, that's also something that was changing even at that stage, that we had the hint books, and Sierra was notorious for making a bigger profit selling their hint books than they were in the original games, and making puzzles intentionally really hard for that reason. And we always tried to be as fair as we could, but of course there's a bell curve with any of these things, of the people that will solve it instantly and the people that will never solve it, and the ones in the middle that just take a while and they generally get it. And it's really difficult to appease all those people, but having hint lines is a way of making sure that nobody's sort of left behind. And then gradually, as online connections became more and more common, and people got to send stuff and post things that way, it was already, I think, by the time the dig came out, easier. You didn't have to wait for a magazine to come out. You could go online for, I guess it would have been AOL and some of the other ones at that point, and start exchanging. And in some, and actually the Lucasfilm, because of the really great high tech people we had, even when I came in there in 1984, they had all of these sophisticated computer systems, and we were sending email across the country, but it literally would take about 6 or 8 hours for email to make a hop from one computer to another, because they would collect it in Berkeley, and then Berkeley would send a bunch over to Colorado, and Colorado would wait for a while to see who else it was getting them from and send it on. And the point is that we had online discussion groups even in those very early days, when it was very painful. I just remember using, was it Usenet? It was called, and just great to be in the forefront. It's the first of almost all of my friends and peers that I actually had a romance with a girl that started in a person-to-person meeting, but developed online in 1980. So I know I was definitely, we were both. So she was in Northampton, Massachusetts, and I was in Springfield, but we were on the same computer system. And surprisingly, instead of typing a text and you send it and seeing 3 dots if someone's typing, that system was set up that each key that you hit instantly is sent over. So you would actually see somebody typing each thing, or hitting backspace and changing the words they were using. And I kind of missed that, because it was really a nice way to get a feel for someone, and you could see them starting to swear or do something that they thought might be offensive, and then deleting it and saying something milder, that sort of thing.
Well, back in 1980, it was just you guys on the internet. You and her. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't even internet. That was just a VAX 11780 that both of us were dialed into through modems that had to stick into the receivers and making all those crazy noises.
Now, you mentioned in the past that none of the elements from your version of the game made it into the final game, but we have the 6-legged creature. When he looks at a turtle in the skeleton puzzle, he says that it's a 6-legged turtle-like creature.
I'd forgotten about that. I did see that, and yes, that may have been a reference, but I'm not absolutely sure that was meant to be a nod.
It just did it on purpose to make the puzzle even harder, because when you have to assemble that turtle, those 6 legs is way too much.
Well, I mean, as I said, Terry, in designing those creatures, started with the skeleton, and so there may well have been, and I know Brian saw that stuff, so there may have been, if not consciously, even some sense of remembering what 6-legged skeletons looked like.
Maybe she can solve the puzzle. We should check if we give her that puzzle, if she can solve it in less than 5 minutes, because she's all about skeletons.
But I think that was the only game she worked on, or certainly one of the very few ones. She worked a lot more in medical illustrations and then film. So my guess is it'd be hard to get her to play a video game.
Now, you've said that your version of the Take tried to incorporate more RPG elements than people at LucasArts were comfortable with. Why do you think those elements made people so uneasy? Was it because this type of gameplay was never produced at LucasArts, or was it just, their mindset at the time?
Yeah, I think it was just the former, that it was something that other companies had done well, but they just weren't sure that it was right for us. The very fact of blending genres, and it's something that it was kind of indicative of a lot of the work that I've done. I added the machine gun scum setup to the Last Crusade game when Indy and his father are in the biplane escaping the Nazis, and worked on the fighting system and that sort of thing. I just wanted to sort of blend in other gameplay elements for people, just to try and make games where the gameplay, to at least some extent, adapts to the preferences of the player. And role-playing games, I had found them fun. They weren't certainly my main source, but I had really enjoyed some of them. And the part that appeals to me even now is the trade-offs involved of, if I use this character, they will take more damage, but they could also heal faster. And as long as I have somebody with a healing potion nearby, that you end up with these really creative ways that players can kind of use the resources they have to solve the problems they have. That's quite different from use shovel on door, that sort of thing. And Hal and I talked about that, and we did a game called Matahari that was distributed by some German companies, and we were really excited because we were making some inroads into how the dialogue puzzles worked, and concretizing concepts that you talk to somebody, and when they tell you something, it shows up in your inventory as information they've given you, and using that information with a different character generates a different voice response, so that it's much more natural. Somebody says, "Oh, you must take a train to Berlin and meet with Herr Schloss at his house." So, being you've got something in your inventory, now if you go to the ticket office, when you show that concept of taking a train to Berlin, you say, "May I have a ticket to Berlin?" You don't say, "Look at this," and they say, "Oh, this is whatever." It becomes much more natural. You've used that same concept. You take it, you're in Berlin, it says, "Where may I find Herr Schloss?" or "Take me to Herr Schloss's house." And it was a way of having the dialogue be natural, but having it be under the control of the player with the objects they were finding. And that's just another example of kind of cross-genre gameplay to try and enrich the whole experience that people are having. And that was really behind a lot of what I was trying to do.
We talked about Ken Mackman's journal, and he notes that the Take was put on hold on June 26th, 1991. What do you remember about that day?
I certainly don't remember that day specifically. I do remember, my last 9 months or so at LucasArts were painful. The company was having some financial pressure, as I mentioned. There was a change in management. Actually, Steve Arnold, who had been my boss from when I came in to, I think, around 89 or 90s, I think, when he left, still, one of the absolute, maybe the absolute best boss I've ever worked for. He actually was trained as a child psychologist before he got into video games. And I've since only half jokingly told people that being a child psychologist is the perfect background for somebody running a game company. Knowing how to keep us from fighting with each other and playing nice with each other, but also understanding a sense of play and joy. At any rate, Steve had left. Doug Glenn took over, who had been our head of marketing. Actually, for a long time after that, the people who ran LucasArts only were there for 2 years to 3 years, and then they had a new one. It was like clockwork. They had to kind of throw them out, and the new person would always want to clean house and get rid of what the other ones had done. And that's kind of what happened to me after, I think it was after Doug left, or it was after Kelly Flock ended up taking over some of that I think that group realized, yeah, things aren't looking too good. Some people thought LucasArts was just going to go under. And so they did some layoffs, made them look good in that they raised the profit margin. And the people that laid me off, for the most part, the management left the company within, I think, a year after that. So they weren't laid off themselves, but you could sort of see that they were preparing to find some way to get out of there. So my whole feeling about that is tempered by this sort of sadness of a group that in the 80s just was a marvelous place, and I loved it. And as it got bigger, as what happens with a lot of companies, more politics came in, and there was more resentment towards many of us who were the old timers. Ron left before I did, but he went off on his own. He took, for a while, everybody thought that the whole company was going to go with him, or at least a big chunk of it, and he ended up only taking a few people at that point. And David Fox had moved on to more management roles, and Rebel Arts and Technologies, which was the location-based group. And so those of us who were key in like 84 or 87, that age, 89, in that time, were kind of moving on to different things anyway. And the ones that weren't, like me, were being not so much shuffled aside, but it just was a different company. I went off to 3DO. I was the 9th employee there, I think, and I just I've always enjoyed being in companies that only have, between 5 and 20 people, because when everybody knows each other, it's a different kind of feeling than when it gets really, much bigger than that.
So at one point after your version of the dig was canceled, LucasArts considered reusing the art assets for a Boba Fett game, but marketing rejected that idea, saying that nobody knows who Boba Fett is. Do you remember hearing about it?
I don't think this is news to me as far as I can recall. I mean, somebody might have mentioned that to me, but because I certainly had a lot of Hal and I stayed friends, and he was there for many years after I left. But no, I don't recall that at all. That's funny, though, particularly given what's been happening with the Star Wars franchise recently.
Now, I think that your version of the dig was ahead of its time. And the reason I'm saying it is not because it sounds awesome and I really want to see it one day, but because around the same time, there were several games that were mixtures of genres that were released around that time. So we have Dune. My favorite Dune game is the first one, in which it has adventure game elements in which you go to the sieges and talk to the Fremen, but you also have the strategy. You have the strategy running in the background, but you still need to talk to people. And I really like that game. And I don't know if you know this, but the Legend of Kyrandia, the first one, was supposed to be an RPG game. But then it was turned into an adventure game. That's why you still have the mechanics of picking up items without actually walking to them and picking them up. Just click on items and place them in your inventory, and your inventory is limited in space, which wasn't a thing in adventure games. It's more of an RPG thing. So,
well, Luke Castle, who was founder of Westwood Studios and who worked on a lot of that stuff, he also did the Blade Runner game that was so well received at the time. He and I are friends, and we tend to think a lot alike about those sorts of things. So I guess it's not surprising. And in fact, he and I had a really serious talk about coming to work on a sequel to his Blade Runner game, because in the Blade Runner game, where you end up being one of three characters depending on the choices you make, he told me that it was Fate of Atlantis that inspired that for him. And, we talked about ways of doing a Blade Runner 2 game. And this was, I don't know, 8 or 10 years after Blade Runner, the first game came out. So I'm not sure what that would put it at. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't the only one. I'm still not the only one in the industry who enjoys mixing together different elements of different game genres and seeing what comes up. Or I've had a friend point out that a lot of games are made by either tacking stuff onto an existing genre from another genre or simplifying it, like real-time strategy games. There were strategy games, turn-based strategy games before that. And they said, let's take some of the real-time fighting elements and make a real-time strategy game. All right, that's good. But boy, these are really complicated. What if you were just building one thing and having it fight, and now you've got a tower defense game? So it's kind of a boiling it down and simplifying real-time strategy to, so you don't have to go through the same complexities of gathering resources. I mean, it's still in there in tower defense, but it's much more simplified. And this kind of wave of let's add complexities by combining things, let's simplify it by, picking just one area. It's kind of a natural wave I see happening throughout games. It's still happening these days. And indie developers are constantly trying either super simple things or trying to conglomerate a bunch of different stuff, and getting some really interesting games out there.
And I mean, mixing RPG and adventure games makes sense. You pick up items and you gather skills, things that you do in an adventure game, only in different ways. But on the other hand, LucasArts always tried to mix action and adventure, which didn't always work together, because you want to play full throttle. You want to talk to people and use inventory items, not kick someone on another bike for half an hour to solve a certain puzzle.
Yeah.
You guys try to avoid that with Fate of Atlantis, because you create those three paths. So you could choose whether you want to go with the fists or the wits or the team.
I think path. that whole process, I mean, certainly a lot of this stuff just evolved. And I know, well, for example, with a lot of the action elements, certainly the stuff that I pushed to put into Last Crusade, the fist fighting and the machine gunning and some of the maze stuff. Those were partly because Indiana Jones as a character was a mix of those things. Likewise, I know with Full Throttle, Tim was basing it around the characters. I mean, he's said many times that mostly you're these kind of wimpy guys, or, and that the Indiana Jones thing was an exception to that. But wouldn't it be cool to be this really tough biker who could beat the crap out of people? And, that was inherent in the character he wanted to create. So having them just have dialogue or solve inventory puzzles wouldn't have been satisfying that way. Did it really work? I mean, the opening cutscene in Full Throttle is one of the best intros I've ever seen, to any game, in that it paints the characters very quickly. It's surprising. It feels very cinematic. I really think in another life, Tim Schafer could have been a good screenwriter, and would have been just as successful. Maybe he would have written more Jack Black movies. There's a lot of reasons that we did things the way we did. not all of them very rational, and certainly not all of them successful.
Well, the thing with Full Throttle, you get a sense that it's a different character because instead of looking for a key, you just kick a door down.
Yeah,
so that was...
It was refreshing in a way. I did enjoy a lot of that. Again, I'm a stickler about puzzles, and I know that that was not one of the favorite puzzle games people had, but in terms of the characters involved and the voice acting and everything, it was definitely one of the top ones the company did. And I think Grim Fandango in particular, I mean, that just did such a great job. Again, it did better puzzles, not the best puzzles, but in terms of creating a world, an interesting world and characters, it, absolutely one of the, and from scratch, just one of the best that the company's done.
Yeah, but when you talk about action sequences, so for example, when they started working on Full Throttle 2 without Tim's involvement, and that game leaned more towards the action and less towards the adventure, then you got pushback from fans of the original game. So I think there's a certain balance that needs to be, that you need to reach when you're working on an adventure game with another genre mixed into it.
Yep.
Now if you had stayed as project lead with unlimited time and unlimited budget, how different do you think your version of the day would have been from the one we know today? Would you have continued with the original design documents? Would you have cut stuff out even though you had time and the resources to implement everything?
I think that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that I would have had the, the willpower to finish it. As I said, there were both good and bad things. I mean, working with Spielberg was great. Later I went to DreamWorks Interactive in part because it gave me a chance to work with him again. But I had some of the rare journal entries I did at the time were about the frustration of scheduling a meeting with both George and Stephen attending when they both were so busy and I was way less important to their helpers and their minders than any of the movie people were. So it's like, yeah, George is busy. Can't do any of that game stuff this week or next week. Well, Stephen is busy at 2:00 on this date. Oh, that date? Yeah, George is available, but not until 4. And neither of them could move it. It's that kind of thing. It was just the amount of complexity of having people like that. I mean, I was the only DIG project leader who had to deal with that. And it was certainly worth the joy and creativity of the design sessions. And those were really fun and very, life-changing for me in some ways of seeing those guys working. But what I do, asking me how I felt that day when they took me off of it, I think there was at least some element of a sense of relief because I wasn't sure where it was going even then. I think if I had the guts to stick with it and finish it, it would have definitely felt more like Fate of Atlantis did, and that I was trying to do some of the same things. But Hal in that case was the one who took it, through production. And if I had been working on the DIG at that point in parallel, it would have had some of those same elements of being a game that felt like it was a different game for each person who played it, at least to some degree. And a lot of that would have been the role-playing aspects intermittently mixing with the fact that you could choose to be the one of the two characters and not have to, you definitely didn't have to play it through a second time as the other character. But that was one of the things I think correctly would have made it more popular, because people who wanted to just get to the end would do it once and be happy. People who said, well, that wasn't 40 hours. Oh, I could do it all over again as another character. And this time I'm going to do some different inventory items and see if that makes a difference. I think there would have been a lot of replayability in the version that I did.
Seems like the feedback you got from players of Loom who complained that the game is too short messed up LucasArts' entire production history in 1991, 1992, and 1993, in the years after.
I mean, Brian had a really clear vision that, we supported. It wasn't so much that we all wanted to make it work. I mean, all of us were hoping to make shorter games because it really felt, as I said, we're running into budget problems, and a lot of the budget, we could have made a simpler game, but we knew that was unlikely to be successful. It's interesting today, if you look at it, people's acceptance of shorter games has gone up, even fairly expensive shorter games. But there also are much longer games, 100-hour plus games you can play. And people's tolerance for paying more, even if you look at a $40 game back in 1990, I'm not quite sure, but that's going to be well over $100 now. And there are very few games that sell for that they've tried to push the price up, but people just don't tolerate more than about 70 or 80, and even that feels a lot. So it's the public is fickle, and it's surprising what they care about. I mean, we were really frustrated at the 40 hours thing, and when you did the math of going to a movie and buying popcorn and the usual stuff, the games were way more cost effective, and you could, I think the break-even point to make the two comparable would have been having games last around 10 or 12 hours. And, they cost a few times as much as movies, but, not 10 times as much. So at any rate, that's my piece on that one.
So I presume that if you were asked today to create your version of the Dig, you'd probably go for it. But if instead you were asked to create a sequel to the original game, would you still do it?
Well, see, the interesting thing now is one of the many interesting things, with the chief one that has come into my mind recently, is AI is a tidal wave moving through the games industry right now. And the games industry has often been at the forefront of new technologies, because if something only works most of the time, or it hallucinates a little bit, that's okay in a game. It isn't okay in a medical product or a business product. So creating a game like a modern version of my original Dig, using AI, I mean, one of the interesting things would be we wouldn't have to make it a multiplayer game. You could just have really interesting AI characters, and naturally you wouldn't trust them completely. But we could have the kinds of gameplay you could have of having, I'm picturing almost like a Survivor TV show version of the Dig, because Survivor has a lot of elements of the Sierra Madre, cooperating and forming cliques, and he wants to kill us off, and we need to get him before he gets us, and then I'll get you because you don't realize I'm double crossing you. And but doing that with AI characters, so you could feel justified in doing it, and not bad about throwing some real humans out of the game, but you just want to be the last character standing. So anyway, I think there are a lot of really interesting things that could be done, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point you couldn't just say to a good AI thing, I'd like to see a game that looks like these elements of Treasure of the Sierra Madre and these elements of Forbidden Planet, with an art style that looks like this, or basically tell an AI to do it and end up with something pretty interesting. We may be within a few years of being able to do that.
Yeah, but that's talking about getting your version out there. How about creating a sequel, given the existing plot that you have in the first game, and expanding on that?
I say that was Brian's to deal with. I mean, that plot is so much his. I don't know. I do feel like I never was able to give Spielberg what he was hoping for, and it would be really interesting for me not to do a sequel to anything that has been done, but to start fresh with that high concept and figure out how to do justice to it with today's knowledge and technology.
That's the correct answer.
Okay.
So you said that you played the final game around 96 or 97.
Probably, yeah. I don't recall exactly when.
And were you aware that you were credited under the Ghosts of Diggs Past in the final game?
Not until I got to the credit sequence, I think. Um, I wonder, I don't recall whether Moby Games was around back then, but it was an easy way to
It wasn't.
yeah, okay. Then probably I had to play through to the end. I might have had somebody tell me that who, played through it before I did. Um, but no, I didn't know beforehand. They didn't mention anything to me.
Okay. Well, it was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, well, it was nice to get that credit. It, I think, as I said, it was fine for Dave and myself. It was a little bit unfair to kind of not give Brian more credit, for story, for example. I think that was Sean Clark and Orson Scott Card, but it is what it is. And with a lot of these things, I found official credits aren't as important as people in the industry knowing what other people have done or even recognizing people's style. And even back in the mid 90s, I was seeing that there were cases where people weren't credited in games, but it was pretty obvious to everybody that knew what was going on that they had a big hand in it. And usually there was some kind of bad blood with the studio that made it.
By the way, you talked about computer game prices earlier, and every year I post the same thing on social media. At the end of the adventure, you had the it wasn't an online store; it was the adventurer store. You'd order by mail, and when the Loom CD version came out, it cost $99.95. $100 back in 92. And every year I post about it in social media because I adjust it for inflation. Because I always ask, would you pay? So this year it was $254. So I ask, would you pay $254 for a 2-hour game? And the CD version is even the abbreviated version of the floppy disk version. So it's even less.
Yeah, although, of course, at that point, CDs were so new and the CD drives were relatively like $400 or $500 in those dollars. And so it was maybe a little bit less. It felt like more of a valuable special thing than certainly today. It sounds like that for this obsolete, distribution format. But yeah, it's... I don't know. It's hard to keep track of what people are willing to pay for or why they think it's valuable or not. I mean, when I first heard about the free to play concept, and people said, "Oh yeah, 95, maybe 98% of the people will get it for free, but the remaining few percent will pay so much that will make a profit." I just told them they were nuts. There's just no possible way that would ever work. And a few years later, I was consulting at Zynga, and they had people, Saudi princes in particular, who were spending tens of thousands of dollars a month on everything you could possibly buy for Mafia Wars or some of their other games. And that was enough to make it not just profitable, but immensely profitable. So yeah, it's hard to gauge.
I found a loophole in that issue of the adventure because if you'd order Loom CD, it would cost you $100, but you can order the floppy EGA version for $49.95, and then you can send the proof of purchase to the adventurer with $25 and get the CD version. So
somebody in marketing must have decided that was a good idea for some reason. That's a funny one. But I like the fact that you're thinking like a gamer, trying to find your way to get the best deal.
So recently, Graham Devine, the creator of The Seventh Guest, announced he's working on a new adventure game engine. And you replied to one of his posts saying that while the look is important, the real heart of point and click is the puzzle and the story design. And you even mentioned that you've got some ideas you never had the chance to implement that you'd be happy to share. Can you tell me a bit about those ideas? Is one of them the melting and freezing lake idea?
No. It was more of what I said that Hal and I did with the dialogue stuff. First, I want to say Graham is a friend of mine, and we came really close to working together on a Magic Leap project that he was heading up, but that was just as Magic Leap was starting to lose its luster, unfortunately. And it was an ILM project that Magic Leap was doing that I would have been part of. So very disappointed that that one didn't come out. And I hope I didn't offend Graham. I knew he would agree with what I was saying, but he didn't respond to that particular post. The thing that I was talking about was when Hal and I did Matahari, we didn't. We were given the concept for Matahari. They wanted to do a game about Matahari right at the beginning, and we had our doubts. We had a discussion of, this is not just a World War I spy, which is kind of old, but the more we learned, we did our research thing like we did with Indiana Jones of, all of the background around her. She was basically a very tragic figure, and so, all right, we've got to come up with a story that was her cover story, that she was a tragic figure. In fact, she was really effective, and she just was better as a spy if everybody thought she was incompetent. And, we built a whole story around that. Anyway, in the process of doing that, we had this idea of tokens as of what you heard in a dialogue. And we started to realize, wow, you could do so much with that. Now that they're physical tokens that you have, you can apply so-and-so told me this secret to, how they did metallurgy. And you add that to some metal that you have and give the two of them to a person who has a smelting furnace. And now you have, the metal, it's basically a way of use shovel with this on that kind of things that we did, but have it be much more sophisticated and be able to do almost anything that you wanted, and not just come up with these sort of harebrained, mix these two things that don't go together, and it has a magical property. That's at the heart. There's a lot more to it than that, but the more we brainstormed about how to use that, the more we realized that you could do some very sophisticated story-based games where you're overhearing things and you're repeating stuff to other people. And every time you do that, it's in the voice of the character, who says that if you give this object to somebody else, they won't read it like it's a piece of paper. They'll express their version of the same concept. There are just a lot of ways that from a storytelling and a gameplay standpoint, it opens up a whole range of possibilities of types of puzzles nobody's ever seen before, more cinematic and realistic things. I mean, part of it was talking to Hal with his movie background and realizing, him vetting the fact that he thought this really would make the games better as story games too. So anyway, I'm talking about it because, I don't think I'm ever going to get a chance to do it. And it's very easy to mention that high concept. It's going to be difficult to implement and find all the things that work and don't work, but I'm sure there are game designers out there that are up for the task.
So since our last conversation, you've gone back to working with one of George Lucas's companies, this time with George Lucas Educational Foundation, as a game design consultant. What can you share about that role? It's
marvelous. I was recommended to those people by Steve Arnold, who was the boss I mentioned that I thought was so good. He actually co-founded the George Lucas Educational Foundation with George back around 1990 when he was still at the company, and still is the co-founder emeritus now and involved with the work they're doing. So, when they were looking for somebody who had more design experience doing serious games, he brought my name up, and that worked out. It's a very small group of people right now. They have a call out for an art director. If anybody who ends up hearing this it responds right away, because I think they're already talking to some candidates. It's really exciting. I moved away from education for a bunch of reasons. I have done several educational games, but it's generally a very frustrating process. For one thing, the budgets are usually ridiculously small. For another, the people wanting to do that don't often understand games. Both of those things are not true of this group of people. It feels much more like the games division did back in 1985 or so, when it was still very new. And the ambitions, they're mentioned pretty clearly in the job description stuff that's out there. So I'm not giving anything away, but there's a real desire to try and reinvent education using modern technology and project-based learning through gameplay, which many of us in the games industry have thought is, well past time for it. But there's a huge inertia in worldwide systems for education, and certainly in the U.S. And we have, I'm just a consultant, but the Lucas Learning Group of the George Lucas Educational Foundation has some wonderfully good approaches that I think may revolutionize the way education works if things go well. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it quite a bit, actually, more than almost any consulting I've done in many years.
That sounds awesome. Can you go to the LucasArts archives as a George Lucas employee?
No, you see, as a consultant, I'm pretty far down the totem pole. So unfortunately, I've been back to Skywalker Ranch a few times, but usually as David Fox's guest, because he's a member of the Producers Guild, and they have sometimes movie screenings there. So he'll bring me or my wife and I along. And it's really nice to get back to Skywalker Ranch now and then. It's still the most marvelous physical location I've ever worked at. And boy, if the George Lucas Educational Foundation decided to open up something there, then I would be willing to do quite a bit to be part of that.
Tell them you lost your keys in the LucasArts archives.
We'll see. I may get another shot at it sometime.
Now, before we conclude our conversation, the DIG will celebrate its 30th anniversary later this year, and your original design document will celebrate its 35th anniversary in December. So what would you say to all of us watching, myself included, who are still hoping to one day see your version of the DIG come to life?
I would say what I said earlier about AI being a way to potentially build something like that with a much smaller team, or at the very least build even a 5-minute taste, maybe something using that puzzle that had been worked out that I described to you. I think we're within 5 years where I might be able to do it with a really good AI program. That and maybe assistance of a couple of friends to add some other pieces to it all. But if it wasn't for AI, I would say it's never going to happen. But I'm a believer that there could be something like that. Or certainly, I am expecting, by the way, and I'll put this out to your audience. So many people have said it's a shame there wasn't an Indiana Jones movie based on Fate of Atlantis, but we're already seeing little snippets of things that are done with AI that convince me, even though it would probably be illegal, some people would do it with a likeness of Harrison Ford. And, I actually do expect to live long enough to see some versions of that, because I think fans will be willing to stretch the rules a bit and try that.
But if we see it in movie form, then you need to choose one of the paths. Which one would be the one in the movie?
Oh, almost certainly the team path. I mean, that was the most popular one and the most compatible, I think, with the way popular movies are done now.
Or since it's done with AI, then you can create all three. And then, if you want an action movie, go watch The Fist's Path. If you want a solo experience, go to The Wit's Path.
Netflix did pretty well with the Bandersnatch version of Dark Mirror. And Brian Moriarty actually had at one point told me he was talking to them about some stuff. But having something that's cinematic and interactive, people have dabbled in that over the years, and we're gradually getting closer.
But unfortunately, they removed that from their platform. They removed all interactive content.
Yes. Yeah, when Mike Verdu was in charge, I mean, he was a big game industry guy for many years, and he was trying a lot of interesting stuff, but he's now moved on. And but these things go in cycles, and if they don't do it, one of their competitors will see it as an advantage and take over, I think. And there are a lot of people, in addition to Spielberg, I've had some conversations over the years with James Cameron, and he's also a game player, but understands how to do storytelling cinematic storytelling that would be a great game. And his Avatar world, I think, is just custom made for some really spectacular gameplay too.
So the Dig celebrates its 30th anniversary in November. You said that in 5 years, AI would be good enough to create your version. So on the Dig's 35th anniversary, I expect to see your version of the Dig coming to Steam or to a digital platform near you. Thank you, Noah, for joining me once again. It's been a pleasure as always. And I would really like to see your version come out. AI or not.
Well, Daniel, you may end up getting an important credit because it may be somebody hearing this very interview that decides to do it on their own or bring together a team of people to do it. Copyright or not, we'll see.
I'll be the ghosts of Dig's past in that version.
There you go. I'll be the specter of the ghost of Dig's past.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you.